began on Christmas night, in snow so deep and silence so heavy that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The forested hills of Belgium's Ardennes were blanketed in white, and the faint glow of burning villages flickered against the horizon like dying candles. It was December 25th, 1944, and while much of the world celebrated peace and family, here in the shattered valleys of the Battle of the Bulge, there was only blood, smoke, and frozen earth. The snow was red with it, the price of a Christmas that would be remembered not for joy, but for slaughter. In this small Belgian crossroads known as Manhay, a brutal clash unfolded, one that would come to symbolize the last convulsions of Hitler's dying war machine and the bitter courage of the men who stood against it. This is the entire history of the Battle of Manhay, the Christmas bloodbath of the Ardennes, the night when the snow burned and the sky glowed with war. By Christmas week, the Battle of the Bulge had been raging for nearly 10 days. Hitler's final offensive, his last gamble to split the Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp, was faltering. In the north, the 1st SS Panzer Corps under Sepp Dietrich had stalled at Elsenborn Ridge. In the south, the German drive toward Bastogne was locked in a deadly siege, but in the centre, in the forests and hills near Manhay, Grandmenil, and Werbolmont, a desperate struggle was underway for control of the key crossroads that led to the Meuse River. Whoever held Manhay would control the arteries of movement for both sides. For the Germans, it was the last open road west. For the Americans, it was the last wall standing before disaster. The village of Manhay, small and unremarkable in peacetime, became the eye of this storm. Its stone cottages, clustered along a single road, were surrounded by dense forest and open slopes, perfect ground for tanks to maneuver and infantry to die. On Christmas Eve, as snow drifted silently from the black sky, the 7th Armored Division and 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army held the high ground around the town. They were exhausted, half-frozen, and outnumbered, but they had orders to hold at all costs. To the east, under the cover of fog and darkness, the Germans were gathering. Among them were the veterans of SS Oberfuhrer Friedrich Fritz Kremer's 6th SS Panzer Army, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, men hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, and driven now by desperation. At their head rolled the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under General Hermann Priess, tasked with punching through the American center and capturing the vital crossroads of Manhay, Grandmenil. To them this was no longer a path to victory, it was a race against annihilation. The night attack began shortly after 10 p.m. on December 24th in blizzard conditions. The snow muffled everything, the rumble of engines, the crunch of boots, even the screams. The first to hit the American lines were tanks of the SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, under Joachim Paper, followed by armored elements of Das Reich. American artillery roared to life, shells bursting across the snowfields in ghostly flashes of red and orange. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, held their fire until the tanks were almost on top of them, then unleashed hell. Bazookas flared in the dark, machine guns stitched the white horizon, and tracer rounds carved through the blizzard like burning needles. For hours the two sides clashed in a chaos of fire and snow. The Germans pressed forward relentlessly, their Panthers and Tigers crushing fences and walls, their infantry advancing in ghostly white camouflage. The Americans fought back with everything they had, but they were tired, cold, and cut off. One after another, their defensive positions were overrun. The town of Manhay itself fell before dawn on Christmas morning, captured by elements of Kampfgruppe Hansen from the 12th SS Division. The Crossroads, the heart of the American defense, was now in German hands. But their triumph was fleeting. Even as the SS raised their banners over the frozen ruins, Allied artillery zeroed in. For 2 days, American gunners pounded the town with relentless precision. Shells screamed overhead, smashing houses, flipping tanks, and turning Manhay into an inferno. The Germans dug in, returning fire, their black uniforms stained with soot and snow. Civilians, those who hadn't fled, cowered in cellars, praying for silence that never came. The air was filled with the smell of fuel, blood, and burning pine. Meanwhile, American reinforcements were on the move. From the west came armored units of the 3rd Armored Division, the 7th Armored Division, and battle-hardened paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne regrouping for a counterattack. At dawn on December 27th, under freezing winds they struck back. Waves of Shermans rolled across the snowy fields, firing point-blank into German positions. Infantry stormed the rubble-strewn streets, clearing buildings one by one. The Germans, out of fuel and ammunition, fought with fanatical determination, but it was over. By the end of the day, Manhay was back in American hands. What remained was a wasteland. The village was flattened, its crossroads marked only by the wreckage of burning tanks and the frozen bodies of men who had fought to the death. The snow was crimson and black, churned by treads and boots, soaked with diesel and blood. Dozens of American and German vehicles smouldered where they had been hit, their steel carcasses steaming in the cold. Soldiers later called it a Christmas from hell. The Battle of Manhay was small compared to the scale of the Bulge, but it was a crucible, a microcosm of the war's final madness. It represented the dying gasp of the German armored might and the unbreakable resolve of the American defense. It was fought not for victory, but for survival, a fight in which no one won, and no one ever forgot. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in January 1945, the snow melted to reveal a landscape of ruin. The Ardennes was littered with the remains of men and machines, their stories frozen in time. Manhay, the little village that had once been a quiet crossroads, had become a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the price of holding the line in the darkest winter of the war. Today, the rebuilt town stands silent again. Its streets are calm, its fields green once more, but beneath the soil lie the ghosts of that Christmas, the soldiers who fought in the dark for a road, a ridge, and a few fleeting hours of ground. The wind that sweeps through Manhay still carries echoes of engines, shouts and artillery, faint and distant, as though the battle never truly ended. The Battle of Manhay was not a grand strategy or decisive victory. It was a human tragedy, a moment when men fought in the snow under the dim light of a winter moon because they were told to hold or die trying. It was the essence of the Ardennes, courage and chaos frozen in time. Tonight we return to that silent crossroads, to the night when Christmas became a battlefield, when faith froze under artillery fire, and when the snow turned red under the shadow of the Reich's last gamble. This is the entire history of the Battle of Manhay, the Christmas bloodbath of the Bulge, where fire met ice and courage met catastrophe. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and quiet, far from the cold winds of the Ardennes, or can you almost feel that frozen air, thick with smoke and silence? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 24th, 1944, 0530 hours. The Ardennes forest. The sound reached them first, a distant rumble like thunder rolling across frozen hills. American soldiers huddled in foxholes near the Belgian village of Manhay lifted their heads from thin blankets and listened. For 8 days that sound had echoed from the south, growing neither closer nor more distant, just a constant reminder that somewhere beyond the snow-laden pines, men were dying. Staff Sergeant William Chapman of the 7th Armored Division pulled his wool cap lower and tried to ignore it. Christmas Eve in a quiet sector, he told himself. Could be worse. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove, how in less than 20 hours this quiet sector would erupt into a maelstrom of steel and fire that would make the previous week's fighting seem almost merciful. The men around Manhay had no idea how much worse it was about to become. They occupied what American commanders called a rest area, a stretch of the front so quiet that exhausted divisions rotated there to recover. The Ardennes had always been quiet. Its steep hills and dense forests made it terrible tank country, and everyone knew the Germans wouldn't attack where tanks couldn't go. So the Americans spread thin across the snowy landscape, one regiment covering what should have required a division, confident that nothing significant could happen here. They were catastrophically wrong. The strategic blindness that had allowed Hitler's offensive to achieve total surprise 8 days earlier still infected American thinking, a dangerous assumption that the enemy would behave according to Allied expectations rather than German capabilities. What those soldiers couldn't know, was that their quiet sector stood directly in the path of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. 8 days earlier, on December 16th, 250,000 German soldiers had smashed into American lines along an 80-mile front. The offensive Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, aimed to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate peace. Hitler had conceived the operation in September, gambling everything on a winter offensive that would replicate his stunning 1940 victory in France. For 8 days, American units had fought desperate delaying actions as German armor poured through shattered defenses. Now on Christmas Eve, the retreating Americans were converging on Manhay, a tiny crossroads village that suddenly mattered more than anyone had imagined. Manhay itself was nothing special. Perhaps 50 stone houses clustered, where 2 highways intersected in a shallow valley. The locals grew potatoes and raised dairy cattle, living lives that had changed little in centuries. Before the war, perhaps 300 people lived there, attending Mass at the small church that dominated the village square, shopping at the single general store, sending their children to the one-room schoolhouse. Now most had fled, warned by the distant artillery that war was coming closer. They left behind empty homes with doors hanging open and chickens wandering through abandoned kitchens, photographs still on walls and dishes still in cupboards. Frozen moments of ordinary life interrupted. But those 2 highways made Manhay priceless. Route Nationale 15 ran north-south, connecting the German breakthrough zone to the Meuse River crossings. 30 miles north, Route Nationale 30 ran east-west, the main supply artery for American forces, defending the northern shoulder of what reporters were already calling the Bulge. Whoever controlled Manhay controlled movement across a critical sector of the battlefield. The Americans stumbling into Manhay on Christmas Eve came from different worlds, and that would prove fatal. The 7th Armored Division had been fighting without rest since December 16th, when they'd raced south to defend the town of St. Firth. For 6 days they'd held that critical road junction against overwhelming German forces, buying time for other American units to establish defensive lines. St. Firth became a meat grinder where American determination collided with German desperation, where every street and building cost lives, measured in dozens. But by December 23rd, St. Firth had become untenable, surrounded on three sides, running low on ammunition, taking casualties faster than medics could treat them. The division, what remained of it, withdrew northward through snow and darkness, leaving burning vehicles and dead friends behind. They'd entered the battle with 88 medium tanks. They arrived at Manhay with 29 still running, and many of those needed maintenance they wouldn't receive. Exhausted men make mistakes. The 7th Armoured soldiers moved like sleepwalkers, their faces hollow with fatigue and shock. Many hadn't slept in 4 days, surviving on coffee and benzodrine tablets that left them jittery and paranoid. They'd seen entire companies vanish in minutes, crushed by German Tigers and Panthers that shrugged off American shells like rain. Their own Shermans burned so quickly crews called them Ronnies, after Ronson-lighters that advertised light's first time every time. Dark humor from men who'd watched too many friends die screaming inside steel coffins, clawing at hatches that wouldn't open fast enough. Now these survivors drifted into Manhay's outskirts, dropped into foxholes or cellars, and fell into unconsciousness still wearing their boots. Officers tried establishing some kind of defensive perimeter, but their men were beyond caring about proper fields of fire or interlocking positions. They just wanted to sleep. Into this chaos came fresh troops. Task Force Kane from the 3rd Armoured Division. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Kane commanded a combined force of tank and infantry companies that had been held in reserve when the German offensive began. His men were rested, their equipment maintained, their tanks fully fueled and loaded with ammunition. They represented exactly what the battered 7th Armoured needed, reinforcement by units at full combat strength. But Kane's soldiers had never experienced real combat. They'd trained in England for months, landed in France after the Normandy fighting ended, and spent autumn conducting occupation duties in quiet sectors. The closest thing to combat they'd seen was guarding German prisoners and manning checkpoints. Now, on Christmas Eve, they rolled into Manhay to defend a crossroads they'd never heard of, alongside men from units they'd never met, against an enemy whose capabilities they couldn't imagine. American doctrine said combined operations required careful coordination, unified command, established communications, rehearsed procedures. Manhay got none of that. The 7th Armoured fell under Major General Robert Hasbrouck's command, but Hasbrouck himself was miles away trying to salvage his shattered division and fighting with higher headquarters about where his units should deploy. Task Force Kane answered to the 3rd Armoured Division, which answered to different corps headquarters through different command channels entirely. Nobody had clear authority over the Manhay sector. Officers from both divisions tried establishing defensive positions, but their soldiers didn't know each other's radio frequencies, recognition signals, or even which units occupied which positions. Radio operators couldn't talk to each other because their SCR 500 and SCR 300 radios used different crystals. Passwords changed at midnight, but nobody knew if both divisions were using the same list. By nightfall on December 24th, Manhay's defenders resembled a pickup basketball team thrown together 5 minutes before game time, except the opposing team had been practicing together for years and played for keeps. The weather that Christmas Eve brought both blessing and curse. For days, thick fog had blanketed the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and giving German forces freedom to maneuver without fear of air attack. American commanders had grown desperate for clear skies that would unleash their overwhelming air superiority. Thousands of fighter bombers, that could turn German columns into burning wreckage within minutes. On December 23rd, the fog began lifting. By Christmas Eve morning, brilliant sunshine flooded the snowfields and the sky filled with American aircraft. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons swarmed German columns, shooting up trucks and tanks by the hundred, their rockets and bombs creating funeral pyres visible for miles. But clear skies served both sides. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted Manhay's importance and photographed American positions, noting every vehicle and defensive position. Ground observers moved close enough to count vehicles and identify unit markings through powerful Zeiss binoculars. The Americans celebrating cautious Christmas in Manhay's cellars, sharing hoarded chocolate bars and singing carols in subdued voices, had no idea they were being watched. 20 miles southeast. In the forests around Hoffelise, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was preparing to move. Das Reich represented the German army's elite, an armored division formed in 1939 from Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, the Leibstandard. These men had fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, and 3 brutal years in Russia. They weren't conscripts or old men scraped from rear area units. They were volunteers in their 20s and 30s, physically fit, ideologically committed, and hardened by combat that would have broken lesser soldiers. They knew winter warfare the way Montana ranchers know cattle. They'd perfected night attacks during the siege of Kharkov, where they'd learned to navigate by stars and conduct armored assaults in total darkness. They'd survived Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, and the nightmare retreat across Ukraine, where they'd fought surrounded for weeks. Now they rolled west with 58 operational tanks, including 28 of the feared Panther medium tanks, with their high-velocity 75mm guns. The Panthers gave Das Reich a technical advantage American tankers couldn't overcome in straight fights. A Panther's sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick, at 55 degrees, could deflect American 76mm shells at any range. Its long-barreled Kowu K-42 L-70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at 2,000 meters, over a mile away. American tankers needed to close within 500 meters for reliable kills, and closing that distance against Panthers usually meant death. The math was brutal, and everyone knew it. Experienced American crews tried flanking shots, aiming for side armor, or hoping to disable tracks, but Panthers were fast and maneuverable, despite their 45-ton weight. American tank destroyers with 90mm guns could hurt Panthers from decent range. But Manhay's defenders had few tank destroyers and many Shermans. They'd need luck, courage, and superior numbers to survive against Das Reich. They were about to discover they had only the courage. SS Sturmbannführer Rolf Thiemann commanded Das Reich's reconnaissance battalion. On Christmas Eve morning, he received orders to probe north toward Manhay and identify American dispositions. Thiemann was 31 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd won the Knight's Cross for capturing a bridge over the Dnieper River in 1943. He understood reconnaissance. You moved fast, observed carefully, killed opportunities when they presented themselves, and survived to report what you'd learnt. Speed and stealth mattered more than firepower. By mid-afternoon, his scout cars were ghosting through forests south of Manhay, watching American vehicles moving through the village from concealed positions 1,000 meters away. What he saw made him smile. The Americans were making every mistake in the book. The Americans were mixing units. Thiemann could see it clearly through his binoculars. tanks from one division parked beside trucks from another, no coordinated defensive positions, vehicles clustered at crossroads instead of dispersed in cover. Supply trucks sat in the open, where a single artillery salvo could destroy dozens. He saw soldiers walking around without helmets, smoking cigarettes, that would be visible for hundreds of meters after dark. These weren't the hardened veterans Das Reich had fought in Normandy British and Canadian troops, who'd learnt brutal lessons and adapted. These were confused, disorganized, possibly inexperienced troops, occupying a critical position they didn't know how to defend. Timon pulled out his map and marked American positions with careful precision, strong points, tank concentrations, likely command posts, supply dumps. Then he drove back to division headquarters to deliver his report. The Americans at Manhay were vulnerable. With proper planning and aggressive execution, Das Reich could smash through them and drive deep into the American rear, possibly reaching the Meuse before American reinforcements could react. That evening, as American soldiers in Manhay opened meager Christmas rations and tried to forget they were in a war, German officers gathered around maps in heated farmhouses. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger commanded Das Reich's 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, and he would lead the assault. Weidinger was 40 years old, another Eastern Front veteran, a careful officer who planned operations meticulously and didn't waste soldiers' lives on glory-seeking stupidity. He'd survived 4 years of war by thinking 3 moves ahead and never underestimating the enemy. He studied Timon's reconnaissance reports and aerial photographs, traced roads with his finger, calculated distances and timing. Then he made his decision. The attack would go in after midnight, using darkness to negate American advantages in numbers and air support. Panzer Grenadiers would infiltrate on foot, creating chaos in American positions, cutting communications, and sowing confusion. Then the Panthers would roll through at first light, crushing resistance before the Americans could organize a coherent defense. It was a classic German night assault, the kind they'd perfected in Russia, where dawn often revealed battlefields littered with enemy dead and German forces in control of objectives that shouldn't have fallen. By 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, Das Reich's assault force was moving into position. Tank commanders checked fuel levels, always a concern since Germany's fuel crisis had become critical, and ammunition loads. Infantry climbed into half-tracks, checking weapons one final time, ensuring machine guns weren't frozen, that grenades were accessible, that everyone knew the plan. Engineers prepared to clear mines if they encountered obstacles, carrying Bangalore torpedoes and wire cutters. Medical personnel positioned aid stations and prepared for casualties. Everyone knew their role. They'd done this before, many times, against Russian armies far larger and often better equipped than anything the Americans could field. Confidence ran through the ranks like electricity. These SS troops considered themselves superior soldiers, better trained, better led, more ruthless and determined than their enemies. The Americans at Manhay were about to receive a terrible education in exactly how right they were. Inside Manhay, some soldiers sensed something wrong. Old hands from the 7th Armoured, men who'd survived St. Vith through luck and instinct, felt the wrongness in their bones. The night was too quiet. Enemy patrols should be probing their lines. Artillery should be registering targets. Something should be happening. Experienced soldiers developed a sixth sense for danger, an animal awareness that prickled when death was near. But headquarters assured them everything was under control. Relief forces were arriving. Air support would be overhead at first light. Intelligence reports said the German offensive was running out of steam. that enemy units were exhausted and low on fuel. Hold your positions, get some rest. Tomorrow would bring better news. So the Americans settled into their foxholes and cellars, posted guards who stamped their feet against the cold, and tried to sleep. Outside, in the darkness beyond their perimeter, engines were idling. Panthers were moving forward, and midnight was approaching like a steel fist. The stage was set for one of the Ardennes campaign's bloodiest small unit actions. In the next 72 hours, Manhay would change hands twice. Hundreds of men would die, and the little Belgian Crossroads would become synonymous with tactical disaster and desperate courage. The battle would prove that technological superiority meant nothing without proper coordination, that fresh troops were no match for veterans without experience, that darkness could neutralize every advantage except training and ruthlessness. But on Christmas Eve, most men in the village just wanted to survive until morning. They pulled blankets tighter against the cold that seeped through stone walls and frozen earth, cleaned weapons they hoped they wouldn't need, wrote letters they might never mail, and thought about homes thousands of miles away. None of them knew that some would never see another Christmas, that their bodies would lie frozen in Belgian snow while families back home hung stockings and sang carols. The battle for Manhay was about to begin, and it would become a masterclass in how modern warfare could descend into medieval savagery when darkness fell and chaos reigned. December 22nd, 1944. Das Reich Division Headquarters, Hoffelei Sector. The Panther sat motionless in the tree line, its long gun barrel jutting forward like an accusing finger. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann stood in the commander's hatch, studying the snow-covered terrain through Zeiss binoculars that cost more than most American soldiers earned in a year. He'd commanded this particular Panther, number 424, since Normandy, and the tank bore the scars of 6 months' continuous combat. 5 white rings painted on the gun barrel marked confirmed kills. 2 spare road wheels were strapped to the turret as improvised armor. Camouflage netting draped over the hull broke up its distinctive silhouette. This tank had become Bachmann's home, his fortress, his instrument of survival, in a war that was clearly lost, but continued grinding forward, anyway. At 33, he was old for a tank commander, and his face showed it, lined and weathered, eyes perpetually squinted against sun glare and engine smoke. The Das Reich division was moving forward, and Bachmann's crew knew what that meant. No rest, no maintenance beyond basic repairs, just another mission in an endless succession of missions that would continue until they died, or Germany surrendered. The division had been in reserve when Hitler's offensive began on December 16th, held back as a mobile exploitation force to pour through breakthroughs created by first-wave assault units. For 6 days they'd waited while other divisions battered themselves against American defenses, listening to radio reports of initial successes turning into bloody stalemates. Now Das Reich was being committed. Their orders were simple: break through at Manhay, drive northwest toward the Meuse River crossings, and don't stop for anything. Simple orders for a complex mission that required everything to go right. Bachmann had been fighting long enough to know that nothing ever went right. Das Reich wasn't just another armored division. It represented the cream of Germany's remaining combat power. Formed in October 1939 as the SS Verfügungstruppen Division, it had evolved from Hitler's personal bodyguard into one of the Wehrmacht's premier fighting formations. The division had fought in the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, the brutal Balkans campaign, where they'd burned Serbian villages and executed partisans by the hundred. Then came Russia. 3 years of the most savage combat in human history, where Das Reich had earned a reputation for both military excellence and war crimes that would haunt survivors for decades. They'd fought at Moscow, Kharkov, Kursk, and through the long retreat across Ukraine. By December 1944, most of the original soldiers were dead, but their replacements had absorbed the division's culture of ruthless efficiency. The division's organization reflected lessons learned in blood across 3 continents. 2 Panzergrenadier regiments, the 3rd and 4th, provided the infantry muscle, elite soldiers trained to fight mounted in half-tracks or dismounted in close terrain. Many Eastern Front veterans who'd survived experiences that would have shattered normal men. The 2nd SS Panzer Regiment provided the armored fist, 58 operational tanks, including 28 Panthers and 30 Panzer Force. Artillery, engineers, reconnaissance, and support units filled out the division. On paper, Das Reich fielded about 18,000 men. In reality, combat losses and the grinding attrition of the retreat across France had reduced effective strength to perhaps 14,000, but those 14,000 were arguably worth twice their number of ordinary Wehrmacht troops. The Panther tank gave Das Reich an edge that American forces couldn't match in direct combat. Developed in response to the Soviet T-34, the Panther represented German engineering at its finest, and its most complicated, 45 tons of sloped armor and high-velocity firepower, capable of 60 km per hour on roads and mounting a gun that could kill any Allied tank at ranges approaching 3,000 meters. The 75mm K-42 L-70 gun fired armor-piercing rounds with muzzle velocity of nearly 1,000 meters per second, enough kinetic energy to punch through the thickest American armor like paper. With 80mm of frontal armor sloped at 55 degrees, Panthers were nearly immune to frontal hits from American 75mm and 76mm guns. American tankers called them the tank we couldn't kill. They weren't wrong. But Panthers came with serious problems that German crews understood intimately. The complex engineering that made them deadly also made them fragile. Final drive units failed with alarming regularity, stranding tanks that hadn't fired a shot. Engines overheated and caught fire. The interleaved road wheels, designed for smooth rides, packed with mud and froze solid in winter, immobilizing 60-ton machines. Panthers consumed fuel at staggering rates, and Germany's fuel crisis meant many tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Maintenance required specialists and special tools that were increasingly unavailable. A Panther in perfect condition was superior to anything the Allies fielded, but perfect conditions were fantasy. Most Panthers rolled into battle with multiple defects, crews praying their tank would function long enough to complete the mission before something broke. SS Sturmbannführer Rolf Tiemann understood these limitations better than most. At 31, he commanded Das Reich's Reconnaissance Battalion, a mixed force of armored cars, motorcycles, and light tanks designed to move fast, gather information, and survive to report it. Tiemann had learned his trade in Russia, where reconnaissance often meant penetrating 50 kilometers behind enemy lines, identifying Soviet positions, and escaping through gaps in their defenses before they could react. He'd won the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest decoration for valor, in October 1943 for capturing a critical bridge over the Dnieper River. That operation had required speed, deception, and ruthless violence. Tiemann excelled at all 3. Now on December 22nd, he received orders that would determine whether Das Reich's offensive succeeded or stalled at its first objective. The orders were straightforward: probe north toward Manhay, identify American dispositions, assess defensive strength, and report back with actionable intelligence. Don't get decisively engaged. Don't alert the Americans that Das Reich was moving into the sector. Just observe and report. Timon assembled his company commanders and studied maps by lantern light in a farmhouse cellar. Manhay sat 15 kilometers north, a tiny village that intelligence identified as a critical road junction. Aerial reconnaissance showed American vehicle concentrations there, but photos couldn't reveal whether those units were combat-ready or exhausted stragglers. Timon would have to get close enough to see for himself. He selected his best reconnaissance teams, veterans who knew how to move unseen, and issued detailed orders. They rolled north before dawn on December 23rd. Moving through winter forests required skills most armies never mastered. Timon's scouts understood that tracks in snow told stories to alert enemies, that engine noise carried for kilometers in cold air, that binocular lenses caught sunlight and betrayed positions. They moved in short bounds, stopping frequently to observe and listen. Motorcycle scouts pushed ahead on foot, leaving their vehicles hidden in tree lines. Armored cars positioned themselves on high ground, with good observation, but covered approaches for quick withdrawal. By mid-afternoon on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Timon's forward elements occupied positions south of Manhay, with clear views into the village. What they saw exceeded expectations. The Americans were vulnerable. Timon could hardly believe their carelessness. Through his binoculars, Timon observed chaos masquerading as defense. American tanks and vehicles were intermixed without apparent organization. Shermans from one unit parked beside trucks from another, no coordination visible. Defensive positions seemed haphazard, without proper fields of fire or supporting positions. Soldiers walked around in the open, clearly unconcerned about observation or snipers. Supply vehicles sat clustered at Crossroads, where a single artillery barrage could destroy dozens. More tellingly, Timon saw exhausted troops, men moving slowly, sitting in positions instead of improving them, exhibiting the lethargy of units at the end of their endurance. These weren't the aggressive, well-trained British and Canadian troops Das Reich had fought in Normandy. These looked like inexperienced Americans, possibly fresh divisions mixed with combat-worn units. Perfect targets for a well-executed night assault. Timon withdrew his scouts before the Americans detected them, and raced back to division headquarters. He arrived after dark on Christmas Eve, striding into the command post where SS Oberfuhrer Heinz Lammerding, Das Reich's commander, was conferring with regimental commanders. Timon spread his maps on the table and delivered his assessment with Germanic precision. Manhay was held by mixed American units, probably under strength, definitely disorganized. No significant obstacles observed. Road conditions good despite snow. A properly executed assault could break through and capture the Crossroads with acceptable losses. Lammerding listened without interruption, then turned to SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, commander of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment. Weidinger would lead the assault, plan it carefully, execute it aggressively, take Manhay and open the road north. Otto Weidinger was everything the SS wanted in a regimental commander: intelligent, ruthless, and experienced. At 40, he'd been fighting since Poland, accumulating decorations and scars in equal measure. He'd commanded infantry companies in France, battalions in Russia, and now led an entire regiment of elite panzer grenadiers. His men trusted him because he didn't waste their lives on stupid attacks, but they also feared him because he demanded absolute commitment to mission accomplishment. Weidinger studied Timon's reconnaissance data and began planning. The assault would combine infantry infiltration with armored breakthrough, Classic German combined arms doctrine that had proven devastatingly effective in Russia. Panzer grenadiers would move forward on foot after midnight, infiltrating American positions in darkness, cutting communications, creating confusion. At first light, Panthers and Panzer IVs would attack, smashing through disrupted defenses before Americans could organize coherent resistance. The plan reflected hard lessons from the Eastern Front. Night attacks negated American advantages in numbers and air power. Darkness made coordination difficult, and Americans, unlike Russians, seemed particularly disoriented when fighting at night. German troops, conversely, had extensive experience in night operations. They'd learned to navigate by compass and stars, to communicate with signal flares and tracers, to use the chaos of darkness as a weapon. Infantry would carry recognition panels to prevent Panthers from shooting them in the confusion. Tank commanders would coordinate by radio, maintaining formation even without visual contact. Engineers would follow closely to clear obstacles. Medical personnel would establish aid stations in captured buildings. Everything was planned, rehearsed, understood. By 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, assault units were moving into assembly areas. Bachmann's Panther was among them. His crew had spent the afternoon preparing checking ammunition, 68 rounds for the main gun, 4,000 rounds for machine guns, topping off fuel tanks, testing radios, inspecting tracks and running gear. The gunner, a 20-year-old from Munich, cleaned the gun breech for the third time and carefully loaded an armor-piercing round. The loader arranged ammunition for quick access, armor-piercing on the left, high explosive on the right. The driver checked gauges and listened to the engine, alert for any sound that suggested mechanical problems. The radio operator tested frequencies and wrote down recognition signals. Everyone knew their job. They'd done this dozens of times before, and most of the original crew was dead, replaced by younger men who'd learnt their trade under fire. As midnight approached, Das Reich's assault force sat in forests south of Manhay, engines idling to keep them warm, crews silent and focused. Over 4,000 men and 60 tanks were about to attack a crossroads, held by perhaps half that many Americans. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. The Germans had surprise, darkness, superior training, and battle-hardened veterans who'd survived 3 years of Eastern Front combat. The Americans had courage, superior numbers elsewhere that could reinforce if given time, and overwhelming air power that would dominate once daylight returned. The next few hours would determine whether German expertise or American material superiority would prevail. Weidinger gave the order, infantry moved forward. The Battle of Manhay had begun, though most Americans sleeping in the village wouldn't know it until German grenades crashed through their windows. December 25th, 1944, 00:15 hours. Southern outskirts of Manhay. Private First Class Robert Chen heard them first, boots crunching in snow too many to be a patrol. He'd been half asleep in his foxhole, dreaming of San Francisco and his family's restaurant on Grant Avenue, when some instinct jerked him awake. Now he strained his ears against the silence, trying to separate real sounds from imagination. There again, movement. Multiple men moving through the forest south of his position. Chen grabbed his M1 Garand and peered into darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hands. The temperature had dropped to maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath froze instantly, creating tiny ice crystals that sparkled in whatever moonlight penetrated the clouds. He wanted to call out, challenge whoever was approaching, but training and instinct kept him silent. Something was very wrong. What Chen couldn't know was that he was hearing the lead elements of SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger's assault force, 2 companies of Panzer Grenadiers from the 4th SS Regiment, roughly 300 men moving through the forest in tactical formation. These weren't ordinary German soldiers stumbling through darkness. These were elite troops who'd practiced night infiltration in Russia, where survival often depended on moving silently through enemy positions. They wore white camouflage smocks that made them nearly invisible against snow. They'd wrapped equipment to prevent rattling. They communicated with hand signals and had memorized the entire approach route so they could move without maps or lights. Most importantly, they had specific objectives: infiltrate American positions, eliminate guards silently, cut telephone lines, and create maximum chaos before the armor rolled forward. The SS troops also had captured American passwords. 2 days earlier, German patrols had grabbed several American soldiers during the confused retreat from St. Vith. End interrogation. Sometimes brutal, sometimes just persistent questioning of exhausted, frightened young men. The prisoners had revealed that day's password and challenge system. The Americans changed passwords at midnight, but German intelligence had learned that all Allied units in the sector used the same list, distributed weekly from Corps headquarters. So when Das Reich's intelligence officer opened his safe and pulled out captured documents, he found passwords good through December 26th. The challenge was Mickey. The response was Mouse. Armed with this knowledge, SS troops could walk right through American lines if challenged. And they did. Chen saw shadows materialize from the tree line, 6 or 7 figures moving toward his position. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. Were they Americans? Task Force Kane had been arriving all evening, and nobody had told him which units were where. The radio operator had said something about the 75th Infantry Division coming up from reserve, but Chen didn't know what their uniforms looked like in darkness. The figures kept approaching, now close enough that Chen could hear their breathing. He had to challenge them. Mickey, he called out, his voice cracking with tension. One of the figures responded immediately. Mouse, perfect answer. Chen relaxed slightly, lowering his rifle. The figures kept coming. One of them smiled. Then the MP-40 submachine gun opened fire, and Chen died without understanding what had happened. The password compromise gave Das Reich troops precious minutes of chaos. All along the southern perimeter, German soldiers walked through American positions, giving correct responses to challenges. Some American guards, suspicious despite correct passwords, opened fire anyway, and were overwhelmed by coordinated volleys from multiple directions. Others died silently, knifed by infiltrators who'd learned that skill in the desperate close quarters fighting around Stalingrad. Telephone lines connecting outposts to headquarters were cut systematically. Radio antennas were sabotaged. Officers trying to organize responses in the darkness were killed by snipers who'd identified command posts during earlier reconnaissance. Within 20 minutes of crossing the American perimeter, Das Reich's infiltration teams had created a penetration nearly a kilometer wide and pushed half that distance into American defensive positions. But confusion worked both ways. In darkness, friend and foe became impossible to distinguish. American soldiers, jolted awake by gunfire and explosions, stumbled out of cellars and foxholes shooting at anything that moved. Some shot other Americans. Some shot at nothing, burning through ammunition in panicked response to muzzle flashes. The 7th Armored Division survivors, already traumatized by St. Vith, reacted with near panic. Men abandoned positions and ran north toward imagined safety, spreading terror as they went. Inexperienced and confused, tried to mount organized resistance, but couldn't identify targets in the darkness. Radio nets became useless, as multiple units tried transmitting simultaneously, their messages overlapping into unintelligible noise. Officers screamed conflicting orders. Tank crews buttoned up inside their Shermans, too frightened to expose themselves, but unable to see anything through periscopes in total darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Kane, commander of Task Force Kane, realized around 0100 hours that he was losing control. His command post in a stone farmhouse on Manhay's southern edge was taking small arms fire from unknown positions. His radio operator couldn't raise half the units, supposedly under Kane's command. Reports when they came through at all made no sense. Germans attacking from the south, Germans infiltrating from the east, Germans already inside Manhay village. How many Germans? Nobody knew. What units were they from? Nobody knew. Where were friendly forces? Nobody knew that either. Kane grabbed his map and tried assembling some picture of the tactical situation, but without reliable information, he was operating blind. He ordered his reserve company, a platoon of Shermans, and a company of infantry to establish a blocking position on the main road south of Manhay. Maybe they could stop whatever was coming. They couldn't. Around 0130 hours, the Panthers attacked. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann's tank was in the lead, rolling north on Route Nationale 15 at 20 km/h, gun traversed left, commander and gunner scanning for targets through sophisticated Zeiss optics that gathered available light better than anything the Americans had. Bachmann had fought in darkness before many times, and he knew the keys to success: move steadily, shoot first, use high explosive rounds to suppress infantry, save armor piercing for enemy tanks. His gunner spotted the American blocking position first. 3 Shermans positioned hull down where the road crested a low rise. Perfect ambush position in daylight. Suicide position at night against veterans who knew what to look for. Bachmann gave terse commands. The gunner laid the crosshairs, checked range 800 meters and fired. The armor-piercing round covered 800 meters in less than a second, striking the lead Sherman's turret at a shallow angle that should have deflected, but instead penetrated clean through. The Sherman's ammunition detonated instantly, blowing the turret 10 meters into the air and incinerating the crew before they could scream. The fireball lit the entire area like daylight, silhouetting the other 2 Shermans perfectly. Bachmann's loader slammed another round into the breach. 8 seconds after the first shot, the second Sherman exploded. The third Sherman's crew panicked, throwing their tank into reverse and backing wildly down the road. They made it perhaps 50 meters before hitting a tree and stalling the engine. The crew bailed out and ran into the darkness, leaving a perfectly functional tank for the Germans to capture. Bachmann's Panther rolled past the burning Shermans without slowing. Behind him 27 more Panthers and 30 Panzer IVs followed in column, pushing deeper into American positions. The American infantry company that was supposed to support those tanks broke and ran. These were soldiers from the 75th Infantry Division, a unit activated only 6 months earlier, filled with draftees who'd completed basic training and shipped to Europe with minimal preparation. They'd never experienced combat before tonight. Now German tanks were rolling toward them in darkness, machine guns chattering, high explosive shells airbursting overhead, and raining shrapnel through the trees. Officers tried rallying them, but human beings have limits. Men who'd been told this was a quiet sector, who'd celebrated Christmas Eve thinking they were safe, suddenly confronted the nightmare of armored assault in total darkness. They ran, Some threw away weapons to run faster. Some ran north towards supposed safety. Some ran east or west, getting lost in forests, freezing to death in snowbanks. Some would wander for days before finding friendly units. Some would never be found. By 0200 hours, Das Reich had penetrated over 2 kilometers into American positions and was entering Manhay village itself. What followed was urban combat at its most savage. German panzer grenadiers moved from house to house, tossing grenades through windows, spraying cellars with submachine gun fire, setting buildings ablaze with incendiary rounds. American defenders tried fighting back, but night fighting in urban terrain favored attackers with initiative and experience. A Sherman tried positioning itself to ambush Panthers on Manhay's main street. A Panzerschreck team, 2 SS soldiers with a shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher, put a round through the Sherman's side armor from 30 meters. The tank didn't explode, but it brewed up, flames erupting from hatches as ammunition cooked off more slowly than usual. 2 crew members escaped, their uniforms on fire. German soldiers shot them before they'd rolled 3 meters. Lieutenant Colonel Kane's command post was overrun around 0230 hours. Kane and his staff tried making a last stand in the farmhouse basement, firing pistols and carbines up the stairs as German soldiers poured through the building above them. An SS sergeant tossed a stick grenade down the stairs. The explosion in that confined space killed 3 Americans and wounded 4 others, including Kane, who took shrapnel in both legs. The Germans came down the stairs carefully, weapons ready, and found Kane trying to tie a tourniquet on his thigh with one hand while holding a .45 automatic in the other. The SS sergeant kicked the pistol away and gestured for medics. Kane had fought well, and German soldiers respected that. He became a prisoner, would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp, and would never fully recover from the wounds or the memory of watching his task force disintegrate in 2 hours. By 0300 hours, Das Reich controlled most of Manhay village and the critical crossroads. American resistance had collapsed into scattered pockets of men fighting isolated battles, cut off from command and unaware of the larger tactical situation. Some fought with desperate courage, holding individual buildings for hours. Others surrendered when German soldiers offered the choice between captivity and death. A few escaped north through gaps in the German advance, carrying word of the disaster to higher headquarters. Weidinger established his command post in Manhay's church, a stone building that offered protection against American artillery that would inevitably arrive. His troops began preparing defensive positions, knowing that American counterattacks would come with dawn. They'd achieved surprise and shattered American defenses. Now came the harder part, holding what they'd taken against enemies who could mass overwhelming firepower once they'd recovered from the shock. As dawn approached on Christmas morning, the situation around Manhay represented disaster for American forces. An elite German armored division had penetrated deep into American positions, captured a critical crossroads, destroyed or captured dozens of American vehicles, and inflicted perhaps 300 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, for relatively light losses of their own. Radio reports trickling back to American Corps headquarters painted a picture of catastrophe. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of 7th Corps, received the news around 0400 hours and immediately began assembling forces for counterattack. But counterattacks required planning, coordination, and time. Das Reich had seized the initiative, and the next 72 hours would determine whether American material superiority could overcome German tactical excellence. The sun would rise in 2 hours, revealing the full scope of the disaster to survivors who'd lived through the most terrifying night of their lives. December 25th, 1944, 06:45 hours. Manhay village. First light came slowly to the Ardennes on Christmas morning, creeping across frozen fields like a reluctant witness to carnage. SS Unterscharführer Klaus Weber stood in the doorway of a shattered farmhouse and watched the darkness fade into grey twilight that revealed what the night had hidden. Bodies lay everywhere, American soldiers caught in the open during the assault, frozen in the positions where they'd died. Burnt-out vehicles smouldered, sending columns of oily smoke into the windless sky. The snow that had been pristine white yesterday was now churned into dirty slush, stained with blood, oil, and the detritus of combat. Weber had fought through 2 Russian winters and thought himself immune to battlefield horror, but something about Christmas morning carnage disturbed even his hardened sensibilities. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and tried not to think about it. The full scope of the night's disaster became visible as daylight strengthened. Route Nationale 15, the main road running through Manhay, was littered with destroyed American vehicles for nearly 3 kilometers. 15 Sherman tanks sat burned out or abandoned, some still idling with engines running, crews having fled in panic. Over 30 trucks and half-tracks were either destroyed or captured intact, including several loaded with ammunition and supplies that Das Reich desperately needed. One American supply convoy had apparently tried retreating north during the battle and driven straight into German positions in the darkness. Every vehicle was destroyed or captured. The supply sergeant's manifest found in a truck cabin listed contents that made German logistics officers salivate: 5,000 gallons of gasoline, 300 artillery shells, 2 tons of rations, medical supplies, and winter clothing. It was a Christmas miracle for troops whose own supply lines were stretched beyond breaking. But the most stunning discovery came when Das Reich soldiers explored American positions overrun during the night. In the pre-dawn confusion, American crews had abandoned equipment wholesale. Engineers found 12 Sherman tanks that were completely intact, engines running, ammunition loaded, radios functional. The Americans had simply bailed out and disappeared into the darkness, leaving millions of dollars worth of equipment for their enemies. Some tanks still had personal effects inside, photographs taped to instrument panels, letters from home stuffed in storage bins, half-eaten rations sitting on ammunition racks. These intimate details of interrupted lives bothered German soldiers more than the bodies outside. The dead were dead, an accepted part of war. But abandoned tanks suggested panic bordering on hysteria, a complete breakdown of unit cohesion that even Eastern Front veterans rarely witnessed. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger toured the captured village as dawn broke, assessing his tactical situation with a professional's cold eye. His 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment controlled Manhay and approximately 2 square kilometers around it. Casualties had been remarkably light, perhaps 40 killed and 80 wounded, far below what he'd anticipated for a night assault against prepared positions. American bodies suggested they'd inflicted 10 times that many casualties, though accurate counts were impossible in the chaos. More importantly, his troops had seized the Crossroads and established blocking positions on all approach roads. Now came the difficult part, holding Manhay against the inevitable American counterattack. Weidinger had no illusions about American capabilities. They'd recover from the shock, mass overwhelming firepower, and come at him with everything they had. The question was whether Das Reich could hold long enough for the offensive's broader objectives to be achieved. Around 0700 hours, American artillery began ranging in on Manhay. The first shells were ranging shots, single rounds fired to establish distance and direction. They landed in fields outside the village, geysers of frozen earth erupting where high explosive met ground. German soldiers heard the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds and took cover in cellars and behind stone walls. Weidinger's artillery liaison officer, a major who'd survived the siege of Leningrad, listened to the shell impacts and made calculations. American 105mm howitzers, probably from 6 to 8 kilometers north. Not enough guns yet for sustained bombardment, just harassment fire while they organized something bigger. He was right. The Americans were still trying to figure out what had happened, scrambling to assemble coherent picture of the tactical situation from fragmentary reports and panicked survivors. The morning also brought American aircraft, and with them the beginning of Das Reich's real problems. Around 0730 hours, a pair of P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Manhay, flying low and slow, pilots clearly searching for targets. These were armed reconnaissance planes from the 9th Air Force, part of the massive aerial armada that Allied commanders could deploy whenever weather permitted. The Thunderbolts circled once, spotted German vehicles in Manhay's streets, and radioed for strike aircraft. Within 20 minutes, the sky filled with Allied planes, Thunderbolts carrying 500-pound bombs and rockets, British Typhoons with their devastating cannon, even a few P-38 Lightnings from a fighter group that had been patrolling nearby. The air assault began around 0800 hours and continued with savage intensity for the next 3 hours. Das Reich's mobile flak units tried fighting back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns put up curtains of fire but forced Allied pilots to stay high, reducing accuracy, but couldn't stop the attacks. A Thunderbolt took multiple hits from a quad 20mm mount and spun into the ground outside Manhay, exploding on impact and leaving a crater 30 meters wide. Another was hit by a 37mm shell that severed hydraulic lines. The pilot nursed it north toward Allied lines, trailing smoke, and managed a belly landing in a field where American troops recovered him uninjured. But these victories were Pyrrhic. For every Allied plane shot down, 10 more appeared. They worked over Manhay systematically, cratering roads, setting buildings ablaze, destroying vehicles that German troops had captured intact just hours earlier. The air attacks revealed Das Reich's fundamental vulnerability. They were operating beyond effective anti-aircraft coverage, in a war where air supremacy determined outcomes. A Panther that survived frontal hits from Sherman guns could be destroyed by a rocket fired from above, where armor was thinnest. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann moved his tank 4 times during the morning, relocating after each air attack to prevent Allied pilots from fixing his position. His crew was exhausted. They'd been fighting or moving for 9 hours straight, but stopping meant dying. Bachmann watched a Typhoon put 2 rockets into a Panzer IV parked in Manhay's square. The tank exploded with such violence that pieces of turret landed 100 meters away. The crew never had a chance. Modern war, Bachmann thought bitterly, was increasingly about technology and less about courage or skill. A farm boy from Iowa flying a plane worth $100,000 could kill Germany's best tank crew with a button press. There was something obscene about it. By mid-morning, Das Reich's tactical situation was deteriorating, despite their hold on Manhay. Fuel was becoming critical. The Panthers and Panzer IVs had consumed enormous amounts during the night attack, and promised resupply hadn't materialized. German logistics were breaking down across the entire Bulge offensive as American resistance stiffened and Allied air power interdicted supply routes. Weidinger's fuel officer reported that most tanks had enough for perhaps 50 kilometers of movement, maybe less. Ammunition was also concerning. The infantry had expended enormous quantities of small arms ammunition during the night fighting, and artillery batteries were rationing shells because no resupply convoy had arrived. Food wasn't a problem yet. Captured American supplies included excellent rations, but medicine was running short. The regimental aid station was overwhelmed with wounded from both sides, and morphine supplies were nearly exhausted. The German soldiers holding Manhay also confronted a grim reality. They were ordered to hold terrain that was nearly indefensible. Hitler had designated numerous positions as fortified places that must be held regardless of tactical circumstances. Manhay wasn't officially on that list, but Das Reich had received explicit orders to hold the Crossroads at all costs. In practical terms, this meant no tactical withdrawals, even when militarily sensible. German officers from the old Wehrmacht knew such orders were often suicidal. Better to conduct fighting withdrawals that preserved forces than die holding worthless ground. But Das Reich was SS, and SS officers obeyed orders even when those orders made no sense. They would hold Manhay until relieved, destroyed, or overrun. There were no other options. Around 0900 hours, American forces launched their first counterattack. It was hasty, poorly coordinated, and reflected more desperation than planning, but it came close to succeeding through sheer audacity. Combat Command A from the 3rd Armored Division attacked from Grandmenil, a village 3 kilometers northwest of Manhay. 18 Sherman tanks and a battalion of infantry from the 289th Infantry Regiment pushed down the road toward Manhay, supported by artillery fire from 2 battalions of 105mm howitzers. The Americans had hoped to catch the Germans disorganized, still consolidating their positions. Instead, they ran into a carefully prepared ambush. Weidinger had anticipated counterattacks from Grandmenil and positioned his best anti-tank weapons to cover that approach. 3 Panthers under Bachmann's command occupied hull-down positions on a ridgeline overlooking the Grandmenil road. PaK-40 anti-tank guns, 75mm, weapons that could kill Shermans at reasonable ranges, were dug in at intervals along the route. Panzer grenadiers with Panzerschreck rockets hid in roadside ditches. The Americans advanced in column formation, tankers buttoned up inside their Shermans, infantry following in trucks. It was tactically naive, the kind of daylight advance that might work against exhausted, demoralized defenders. Against Das Reich veterans, it was suicide. Bachmann let the American column close to 800 meters before opening fire. His first shot hit the lead Sherman in the frontal glacis, the round penetrating despite the shallow angle and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank stopped dead, smoke pouring from hatches. Before American tankers could react, Bachmann's gunner had fired again, hitting the second Sherman in the turret. That tank exploded catastrophically, turret flipping through the air. The other Panthers opened fire, selecting targets with methodical precision. Within 90 seconds, 11 of 18 American tanks were burning. The surviving Shermans reversed frantically, trying to escape the kill zone, but PaK-40 guns caught them from flank positions. Only 3 Shermans made it back to Grandmenil, and one of those was so damaged it would never fight again. The infantry suffered worse. When the lead tanks exploded, the trucks following them stopped in confusion. Panzer Grenadiers opened fire with MG-42 machine guns that fired 1,200 rounds per minute, creating a wall of lead that shredded unarmored vehicles. American soldiers bailed out and tried taking cover in roadside ditches, but German mortars had those areas pre-registered. High explosive rounds began dropping among them with horrifying accuracy. Company A of the 289th Infantry, 140 men, lost 92 killed or wounded in 15 minutes. The survivors crawled back toward Grandmenil, leaving their dead and equipment behind. The counterattack had failed completely, and the Americans had lost combat power they couldn't easily replace. But the failed counterattack revealed something important to higher American headquarters. Das Reich was strong but not invincible. The Germans had ambushed the attack, suggesting they'd prepared defensive positions, which meant they intended holding Manhay rather than pushing north. That gave American commanders time to organize proper combined arms assaults, rather than hasty, piecemeal attacks. Major General J. Lawton Collins, a hard-driving corps commander, nicknamed Lightning Joe, began assembling overwhelming force for a deliberate assault. If the Germans wanted Manhay badly enough to fight for it, Collins would oblige them. But the next American attack would come with proper artillery preparation, air support, and enough combat power to grind through whatever Das Reich could throw at them. It would take time to organize, perhaps 48 hours, but when it came, it would be unstoppable. As Christmas Day afternoon arrived, both sides settled into temporary stalemate. Das Reich controlled Manhay, but was taking steady casualties from American artillery and air attacks. Their fuel and ammunition situations were deteriorating hourly, and no relief or resupply seemed forthcoming. American forces surrounded Manhay on three sides, but lacked the combat power to dislodge veteran SS troops from prepared positions. Both sides counted their dead, treated their wounded, and prepared for battles they knew were coming. In Manhay's ruined church, Weidinger studied maps and calculated how long his regiment could hold. In command posts kilometers away, American staff officers planned the offensive that would retake the Crossroads. The battle had entered its second phase, and the bloodiest fighting was yet to come. The dawn had revealed the slaughter, but nightfall would bring worse. December 26, 1944. 0500 hours, 3rd Armored Division Assembly Area. Major Robert Bellamy hadn't slept in 36 hours, and it showed in the tremor of his hands as he spread maps across the hood of his jeep. As executive officer of the 33rd Armored Regiment, he was responsible for translating Major General Maurice Rose's aggressive orders into tactically sound operations. The orders from Rose were characteristically blunt: retake Manhay, restore the front line, do it immediately. Rose, one of the most demanding commanders in the European theatre, didn't accept excuses or tolerate failure. He expected results regardless of cost. Bellamy stared at the map and tried calculating how many of his men would die in the next 24 hours. The numbers kept coming up worse than he wanted to admit. The 3rd Armored Division represented one of America's premier fighting formations, but even elite units had limits. Activated in April 1941, the division had fought across France and into Belgium, earning a reputation for aggressive armored warfare. Rose commanded with an iron hand, pushing his units hard, relieving officers who didn't meet his standards, and leading from the front in a way that inspired soldiers even as it terrified them. But aggressive leadership couldn't overcome tactical reality. The division's tanks were Shermans, decent vehicles, but outmatched by German Panthers in direct combat. Their crews were increasingly inexperienced as veterans rotated home or died, replaced by young men fresh from stateside training. and Rose's insistence on immediate attack meant launching operations without proper preparation, reconnaissance, or coordination. It was a recipe for high casualties. Combat Command A received the mission attack south from Grandmenil, break through Das Reich's defensive positions, and recapture Manhay. The attacking force included Company A of the 33rd Armoured Regiment, 14 Sherman tanks, reinforced by a battalion from the 289th Infantry Regiment, and supported by 2 artillery battalions. On paper, it looked like adequate combat power. On the ground, facing SS troops in prepared positions with superior tanks, it was barely sufficient. But Rose wanted attack by 0530 hours before full daylight, hoping to achieve some surprise. So Combat Command A mounted up in darkness, tankers performing final checks by flashlight, infantrymen climbing into half-tracks with the resigned fatalism of men who knew they were heading into a meat grinder. Company A was commanded by Captain James Hadley, a 32-year-old officer from Pennsylvania who'd commanded tanks since North Africa. Hadley was competent, careful, and respected by his men, exactly the kind of officer who hated orders that seemed designed to get people killed. He'd studied the terrain between Grandmenil and Manhay, walked the ground yesterday despite sniper fire, and knew the route was death trap. The road ran through open country for 2 kilometers with minimal cover, crossed a low ridgeline that offered perfect defensive positions, and terminated in Manhay, where German tanks could position themselves in defilade. Attacking down that road in daylight was suicidal. Attacking before dawn, when American advantages in numbers meant nothing, was even worse. But orders were orders. Hadley briefed his tank commanders, watched doubt flicker across their faces, and tried projecting confidence he didn't feel. The attack began exactly on schedule. 14 Shermans rolled south from Grandmenil in column formation, hatches buttoned, engines roaring, tracks clanking on frozen ground. Behind them came half-tracks carrying infantry, and behind those came headquarters vehicles and supply trucks. American artillery fired preparation fires, a 5-minute barrage that dropped perhaps 300 rounds on suspected German positions around Manhay. It was inadequate fire support by any standard, but Rose hadn't allocated time for proper artillery preparation. The shells stopped falling at 0525. At 0530, Hadley's lead tank crested the ridgeline south of Grandmenil and silhouetted itself against the pre-dawn sky. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann, waiting in the exact position he'd occupied yesterday, centered his gunner's crosshairs on that silhouette and gave the order to fire. The armor-piercing round struck Hadley's Sherman on the turret front, penetrated and killed everyone inside instantly. The explosion was visible for kilometers, an orange-red fireball that consumed the tank and everyone in it within seconds. Hadley died without knowing what hit him, incinerated before his brain could process the impact. The second Sherman in column swerved left, trying to avoid the burning wreck, and exposed its thinner side armor to Bachmann's gunner. The second shot took 3 seconds to aim and fire. It hit below the turret ring, penetrated into the crew compartment, and detonated ammunition. That Sherman burned even hotter than the first. The third tank commander, a lieutenant on his first combat operation, panicked and ordered his driver to reverse. The Sherman backed down the ridgeline, crashed into a stone wall, and through a track. The crew bailed out and ran, abandoning a functional tank for the second time in 2 days. The remaining 11 Shermans tried pressing the attack, but they were fighting blind. Pre-dawn darkness made target acquisition nearly impossible. and German muzzle flashes appeared and disappeared too quickly to track. American tank commanders couldn't use their superior numbers because the road restricted them to single-file advance. Each Sherman that crested the ridgeline was silhouetted perfectly and destroyed within seconds. German anti-tank guns joined the slaughter, Pak-40s firing from concealed positions that American tankers couldn't spot until rounds were already impacting. By 05:45, 15 minutes after the attack began, Company A had lost 9 of 14 tanks and accomplished nothing. The remaining 5 Shermans withdrew in disorder, some firing wildly at suspected German positions, others just running for their lives. It was a complete disaster. The infantry following the tanks fared even worse. When the lead Shermans exploded, half-tracks carrying the assault companies stopped in confusion. Infantry officers tried organizing dismounted attacks, but German machine guns opened fire from positions the artillery barrage hadn't touched. MG-42 machine guns, weapons Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw for their distinctive sound, created interlocking fields of fire that turned the road into a kill zone. Soldiers tried taking cover, but found little protection in frozen ground. Mortar rounds began falling with the precision that suggested German forward observers had the entire approach route pre-registered. High explosive rounds with contact fuses detonated on impact, creating lethal fragmentation that scythed through exposed infantry. 1st Platoon of B Company, 289th Infantry, ceased to exist as a combat unit in under 10 minutes. 42 men had climbed into half-tracks at Grandmenil, 14 made it back, and 6 of those were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. The platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Park, 23 years old, commissioned 6 months earlier, died on the road with 27 of his men. His body wasn't recovered for 3 days. When Graves' registration finally reached him, they found he'd been hit by at least 8 separate shell fragments. The medic who'd tried saving him was also dead, killed while administering morphine. War didn't discriminate between brave and cowardly, careful and reckless. It just killed whoever was in the wrong place when steel met flesh. By 06:30 hours, Combat Command A's attack had failed completely. American forces retreated to Grandmenil, having lost 14 tanks, destroyed or abandoned, over 100 infantry casualties, and numerous vehicles. They'd inflicted minimal damage on Das Reich positions, and hadn't advanced more than a few hundred meters. Major General Rose, monitoring the battle from his command post, was furious. He relieved the Combat Command A commander on the spot, an unjust decision since the officer had simply executed impossible orders and demanded immediate renewed attack. Division staff officers, experienced enough to recognize disaster when they saw it, carefully suggested that perhaps more preparation was needed. Rose overruled them. The attack would continue, Manhay would be retaken. Casualties were irrelevant compared to mission accomplishment. The second attack, launched at 0900 hours, was slightly better organized but achieved similar results. This time Combat Command B attacked with artillery preparation that lasted 20 minutes rather than 5, with infantry leading the advance to suppress German anti-tank weapons, and with tank destroyers providing overwatch from hull-down positions. It was better tactics, but Das Reich had all day to prepare. They'd reinforced positions, repositioned weapons to cover new approaches, and laid hasty minefields on likely avenues of advance. The Americans made it farther this time, almost a kilometer, before the assault stalled in the face of withering defensive fire. They lost another 8 tanks and perhaps 75 casualties before withdrawing. Rose ordered third attack for afternoon. His staff began quietly calculating how long the division could sustain such losses. The afternoon attack on December 26th represented American tactical doctrine at its most frustratingly predictable. Artillery fired preparation fires for 30 minutes, dropping over 1,000 rounds on Manhay and approaches. Fighter bombers strafed and bombed German positions, claiming destruction of numerous targets. Then American armor and infantry advanced down the same routes they'd attacked that morning, as if hoping repetition would achieve different results. Das Reich defenders, many of whom had fought in Russia, where Soviet tactics often involved similar repetitive assaults, knew exactly what to expect. They waited in positions that artillery hadn't touched, stone cellars, reverse slope positions, carefully camouflaged firing points, and destroyed the Americans systematically. This attack penetrated to within 800 meters of Manhay before stalling. American casualties: 11 tanks, 90+ infantry. German casualties: perhaps 20 wounded, no tanks lost. The math was unsustainable. That evening, Major General Maurice Rose convened his senior officers for what army culture euphemistically called an ass-chewing. Rose was legendary for his temper and his refusal to accept failure. He stood at his map table, glaring at subordinates who'd fought hard all day, and demanded to know why Manhay remained in German hands. The officers, exhausted and demoralized, offered explanations. German defensive positions were stronger than intelligence suggested. Enemy tanks outmatched American Shermans technically. Attacking down restricted routes negated American numerical superiority. Rose dismissed every explanation as excuse-making. The division would attack again tomorrow. Plans would be better. Execution would be more aggressive. Results would be achieved or more officers would be relieved. The meeting ended with everyone understanding that professional survival required success regardless of casualties. It was leadership by intimidation, and it would cost lives. But Rose wasn't entirely wrong to demand results. The strategic situation in the Bulge was stabilizing, and American commanders were shifting from desperate defense to deliberate counteroffensive. Manhay represented a festering wound in American lines, a German salient that threatened supply routes and tied down forces needed elsewhere. Recapturing it had become militarily necessary and politically important. Supreme Headquarters wanted victories to demonstrate the German offensive had failed. Newspaper correspondents were writing stories about American resilience, and those stories needed successful counterattacks to justify optimistic headlines. So soldiers would continue dying at Manhay because strategic and political considerations outweighed tactical realities. That was modern war, young men's lives expended to satisfy requirements far removed from actual fighting. December 27th brought more of the same. Another pre-dawn attack, another failure, another casualty list that made headquarters clerks wince as they typed names. American forces managed capturing Grandmenil village itself. Das Reich hadn't heavily defended it, falling back to stronger positions around Manhay, but couldn't push beyond. German defensive fire remained devastatingly effective. American tankers were developing healthy fear of any approach to Manhay, knowing that SS gunners would be waiting in positions impossible to spot until rounds started impacting. Infantry became increasingly reluctant to advance without armor support, but armor couldn't advance without infantry to suppress anti-tank weapons. It was tactical stalemate enforced by German expertise and American blood. By evening of December 27th, the 3rd Armored Division had lost over 40 tanks, and perhaps 400 casualties in 3 days of attacks. They'd advanced perhaps 2 kilometers. Manhay remained firmly in German hands, and Das Reich showed no signs of weakening. American commanders finally accepted that frontal assaults weren't working. New plans were developed involving massive artillery preparation, overwhelming air support, and attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. It would take time to organize, perhaps another day, but when it came, it would represent American warfare at its most characteristic, accepting that you can't outfight the enemy tactically, so you bury them under material superiority they can't match. The blood price of Grandmenil had been paid. Now Das Reich would learn the price of holding Manhay against enemies who could replace losses while Germans could not. December 27th, 1944, 0600 hours. Manhay Village. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Zimmermann conducted his morning inventory with the methodical precision of a man who understood that carelessness meant death. As commander of 2nd Company, 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, he was responsible for roughly 100 men defending Manhay's eastern sector. Or rather, he'd started with 100 men 3 days ago. This morning's roll call counted 73 combat-effective soldiers. The rest were dead wounded, or so exhausted they couldn't be trusted in fighting positions. Zimmermann walked through his company's defensive positions, checking ammunition supplies, inspecting weapons, evaluating the physical and mental condition of troops who'd been fighting almost continuously for 72 hours. What he found worried him more than he'd admit to his men. Ammunition was becoming critical across Das Reich's positions. Zimmermann's riflemen had perhaps 50 rounds per man remaining, enough for one serious firefight. Machine gun teams were down to their last few belts, maybe 300 rounds per gun. That might sound like plenty to civilians, but MG-42s fired 1,200 rounds per minute. In a sustained engagement, 300 rounds lasted 15 seconds. Zimmermann had already ordered gunners to fire only short bursts, conserving ammunition for the major American attack. Everyone knew was coming. Grenades were nearly gone, perhaps 2 per soldier, when doctrine called for 6. Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launchers had 4 rockets remaining in the entire company when they needed dozens to stop American armor. The artillery battalion supporting them was rationing shells so severely they could barely respond to fire missions. Das Reich was running dry. The fuel situation was even worse. Zimmermann walked past a Panther tank that had been positioned to cover the eastern approach road 3 days ago, and hadn't moved since. Not because the crew was dead or the tank damaged, the vehicle was mechanically sound. It simply had no fuel. Fuel gauge read empty, and no resupply had arrived, despite repeated requests to division logistics. The tank commander, an SS Oberstscharführer, who'd survived 2 years in Russia, sat on the turret smoking and watching the horizon. His Panther had become a 75mm pillbox, immobile but still dangerous, if Americans attacked within range. Better than nothing, but not by much. Across Das Reich's defensive perimeter, similar scenes repeated. Vehicles that should be maneuvering to meet threats sat frozen in place, burning precious fuel, just to keep engines warm enough to start when needed. The medical situation was deteriorating into crisis. Manhay's church basement served as the regimental aid station, and conditions there would have horrified peacetime doctors. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Kraus, the regimental surgeon, worked by candlelight and dim electric bulbs, treating wounded from both sides with dwindling supplies. Morphine was nearly exhausted. Kraus had perhaps 20 ampoules remaining when he needed hundreds. He was performing triage of the cruelest sort, deciding which wounded men received pain relief and which would suffer consciously. Sulfur drugs for infection were gone. Plasma for blood loss was gone. Bandages were being reused after washing in boiled water, a practice that risked infection but was better than no bandages at all. The wounded lay on pews and floor, Germans and Americans mixed together, moaning or screaming depending on their injuries and pain tolerance. Krolls had been a surgeon in civilian life, practicing in Munich before the war. He'd joined the SS medical service, believing he'd serve German soldiers in modern, well-equipped hospitals. Instead, he'd spent 3 years in Russia, performing amputations in abandoned farmhouses, extracting bullets by flashlight, watching men die from wounds that proper hospitals could have easily treated. Now on Christmas week 1944, he was essentially practicing medieval medicine in a church basement, while artillery shook dust from the rafters. A young panzer grenadier, perhaps 19 years old, lay on a pew with his intestines exposed by shrapnel. Krolls knew the boy would die, probably within hours, but morphine might ease his passing. Except there was another soldier with a chest wound who might survive if given morphine to manage pain during treatment. The surgeon made his choice and moved on, trying not to think about it. War reduced moral choices to mathematics of survival. The wounded included Americans, which created its own complications. German soldiers had captured perhaps 40 American prisoners during the initial assault and subsequent fighting. Some were wounded, some uninjured but too shocked or exhausted to resist. Wehrmacht regulations and Geneva Conventions required treating prisoners humanely, providing medical care, and protecting them from combat. Das Reich followed these rules inconsistently. Some officers adhered strictly, others saw prisoners as burdens consuming scarce resources. The regimental commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, had ordered humane treatment, and most soldiers complied. But tension existed between doing what was right and what was expedient when your own men were dying from lack of medical supplies. An American sergeant named Richard Morrison lay in the church basement with his left leg shattered by tank fire. He'd been commander of a Sherman destroyed on December 25th, had crawled from his burning tank with both legs broken, and spent 12 hours in the snow before German soldiers found him and dragged him to the aid station. Krauss had set Morrison's leg using splints made from fence posts and bandages torn from spare uniforms. It was crude work, but it might save the leg if Morrison survived long enough for proper treatment. Morrison was conscious, lucid, and terrified. He'd heard stories about SS troops executing prisoners, stories that were sometimes true and sometimes propaganda. But the German doctor and medics had treated him decently, shared their meager rations, even given him water from their own canteens. War was revealing itself to be more complex than Morrison's training had suggested. Enemies could be humane, and survival often depended on luck rather than virtue. Above the church basement, the defensive battle continued with grinding intensity. American artillery had found the range to Manhay and was systematically destroying the village. Shells arrived every few minutes, sometimes singly, sometimes in salvos of 6 or 8 rounds that created multiple simultaneous explosions. 105mm high explosive rounds collapsed stone buildings, turning structures that had stood for centuries into rubble. American gunners were conducting methodical destruction, working from grid square to grid square, ensuring that no building in Manhay remained intact. It was effective if unimaginative: reduce everything to rubble, kill anyone hiding in the ruins, then assault with infantry to clear survivors. Soviet tactics, learned at enormous cost in Stalingrad and perfected through repetition. Americans were proving to be fast learners. SS Untersturmführer Klaus Weber, the soldier who'd watched dawn reveal Christmas carnage, was positioned in a stone farmhouse on Manhay's southern edge. Or rather, he'd been in a farmhouse. American artillery had destroyed the upper floor, leaving only the cellar and partial ground floor walls. Weber and his squad sheltered in the cellar during bombardments, then rushed upstairs to firing positions when attacks developed. It was exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and quick reactions. Yesterday, Weber had been too slow returning to the cellar before artillery arrived. The concussion from a nearby shell burst had thrown him against a wall, giving him a concussion that left him dizzy and nauseous. The company medic had examined him, determined he didn't have serious brain injury, and sent him back to his position. There were no rear area rest positions, no evacuation for minor injuries. Everyone fought until they died, or became physically unable to continue. The psychological strain was beginning to show across Das Reich's defensive positions. These were veteran troops, hardened by years of combat, but even veterans have breaking points. The constant artillery fire prevented rest. You couldn't sleep when shells might land on you any moment. The lack of hot food drained morale. Captured American rations were better than German field rations, but everything was cold, eaten from cans in frozen cellars. The knowledge that no relief was coming weighed heavily. In Russia, surrounded units could sometimes expect breakout attempts or relief columns. Here in the Ardennes, everyone understood the offensive had failed. Das Reich was holding Manhay, not because it mattered strategically, but because Hitler's orders prohibited withdrawal. They were dying for a crossroads that no longer served any purpose. Yet discipline held. SS training emphasized obedience, unit cohesion, and ideological commitment that transcended rational self-interest. These soldiers believed they were defending Germany against enemies who would destroy their nation if victorious. Many believed the propaganda about American and Soviet war aims, convinced that German defeat meant annihilation. Some fought from simple professionalism. They were soldiers, this was their mission. Personal feelings were irrelevant. Others fought because their comrades fought, unwilling to betray men they'd shared years of combat with. A few fought hoping for miracle weapons or political developments that would change the war's trajectory. Most fought because they had no other choice, and dying in combat seemed preferable to surrender and uncertain fate as prisoners. Around noon on December 27th, word spread through Das Reich's positions that a major American attack was imminent. Forward observers reported concentrations of American armor and infantry assembling northwest of Manhay. Artillery spotter planes, small Piper Cubs that Americans used for observation, were circling overhead, clearly directing fire missions. American fighter bombers were attacking with increased intensity, their bombs and rockets systematically destroying any vehicle visible from the air. Weidinger issued orders preparing for the assault, all personnel to fighting positions, anti-tank weapons positioned to cover likely approach routes, artillery to prepare defensive fires. Everyone checked weapons one last time and waited. The Americans were coming, and this attack would be different, bigger, more coordinated, backed by overwhelming firepower. But the attack didn't come that afternoon. American commanders were still organizing, assembling more combat power, coordinating air and artillery support. Das Reich soldiers waited in their positions as afternoon faded into evening, tension increasing with each passing hour. Some welcomed the delay, grateful for every additional hour of survival. Others preferred getting it over with, knowing that waiting just prolonged the inevitable. As darkness fell on December 27th, Manhay resembled a medieval fortress under siege, surrounded, bombarded, running low on supplies, but still defiant. The defenders knew they couldn't hold indefinitely. The Americans knew they'd eventually succeed through material superiority, but neither side knew exactly when or how the end would come, so both prepared for another day of killing, That was the reality of modern war, not glorious charges or heroic last stands, but grinding attrition where survival was temporary and death merely postponed. The night brought new terrors. American artillery continued harassing fires, shells arriving randomly every few minutes, preventing rest, inflicting casualties among troops too tired to react quickly. German soldiers huddled in cellars and foxholes, trying to sleep in shifts, knowing tomorrow would bring the assault they'd been anticipating. Some wrote letters home, though postal service had broken down and letters would likely never arrive. Some cleaned weapons for the dozenth time, seeking comfort in familiar routine. Some prayed. Even SS soldiers found religion when death seemed imminent. And some just sat in darkness, too exhausted for fear, waiting for whatever came next. Das Reich's defense of Manhay was entering its final phase, though nobody yet knew how many more would die before the battle ended. December 28th, 1944. 0600 hours. American artillery positions, 5 kilometers north of Manhay. Captain Donald Hayes stood beside his 105mm howitzer and watched his gunners prepare for the fire mission that would define their war. As battery commander of Baker Battery, 327th Field Artillery Battalion, Hayes controlled 6 guns that could each fire 4 rounds per minute, sustained fire that would turn Manhay into hell on earth. He'd received the fire plan an hour ago, studied the coordinates and timing with growing disbelief, then checked with battalion to confirm the orders were correct. They were. American commanders had decided that if tactical finesse couldn't dislodge Das Reich from Manhay, then overwhelming firepower would simply erase the village and everyone in it. Hayes had been firing artillery since North Africa and thought himself immune to squeamishness, but something about the methodical destruction planned for this morning disturbed his professional sensibilities. This wasn't precision fire supporting infantry assault. This was annihilation. The fire plan called for a time-on-target mission, toe-tier in artillery parlance, where multiple batteries fired from different positions with rounds calculated to impact simultaneously. It was complex fire coordination, requiring precise calculation of range, charge, and timing for each gun. Done correctly, toe-tier missions created devastating effects because targets received no warning, one moment silence, the next moment dozens of shells exploding simultaneously. Hayes's battery was one of 12 participating, meaning 72 guns would fire on Manhay at exactly 0600 hours. Each gun would fire 20 rounds in the initial barrage, then continue with sustained fire mission. Simple mathematics. 72 guns times 20 rounds equals 1,440 shells, landing on an area roughly 500 meters square. It would be the most intensive bombardment Hayes had participated in since Casino, and that realization brought back memories he'd tried forgetting. At precisely 0600 hours, Hayes gave the order. His battery's 6 guns fired within seconds of each other, creating concussive blasts that shook the frozen ground and sent flocks of crows screaming from nearby trees. The 105mm shells, each weighing 33 pounds, arced through the pre-dawn darkness toward Manhay, 5 kilometers south. Hayes couldn't see the impacts from his position, but forward observers with radios would report results and adjust fire if necessary. The guns continued firing, loaders working with mechanical efficiency, breaches opening and closing, empty brass casings piling up in frozen mud. Within 5 minutes, Hayes's battery had fired over 100 rounds. Across the artillery concentration, other batteries maintained similar rates of fire. The bombardment had become industrial-scale killing, reducing warfare to tonnage of explosives delivered per minute. In Manhay, the bombardment arrived with apocalyptic fury. SS Unterscharführer Klaus Weber was in his cellar position when the world exploded. The first shells, dozens impacting within seconds, created a roar so overwhelming it transcended sound and became physical pressure that squeezed lungs and stopped thought. The stone building above Weber's cellar disintegrated, walls collapsing inward, roof beams crashing down. Weber and his squad pressed themselves against cellar walls, mouths open to equalize pressure, hands over ears in futile attempt to block the noise. Shells kept falling, each explosion merging with others into continuous thunder. Dust filled the cellar, making breathing difficult. Small stones and debris rained down through the collapsed ceiling. Men screamed but couldn't hear their own voices over the bombardment. The systematic destruction of Manhay represented American firepower doctrine at its most characteristic. When you couldn't defeat the enemy tactically, you buried them under material superiority. Every building in Manhay was targeted. Stone structures that had survived centuries collapsed into rubble. Wooden buildings simply vanished, blown apart by high explosive impacts. The village church, where Das Reich's aid station, sheltered wounded from both sides, took multiple direct hits. The roof collapsed first, stone tiles crashing down onto the nave. Then shells penetrated the weakened structure and exploded inside, killing or wounding everyone who couldn't reach the basement. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Krauss, the regimental surgeon, died instantly when a shell burst inside the church killed him, and a dozen wounded men he'd been treating. The American sergeant, whose leg Krauss had splintered, died in the same explosion, pulverized beyond recognition. War made no distinctions. The artillery barrage lasted 15 minutes of sustained fire, then shifted to harassing fire that would continue throughout the day, shells arriving every few minutes, preventing movement, killing anyone exposed. Forward observers adjusted fire onto specific targets. A Panther tank that had survived previous bombardments took 3 direct hits and brewed up, ammunition detonating in secondary explosions. A stone farmhouse serving as company headquarters collapsed when shells breached walls and exploded inside. Even cellars supposedly safe from artillery became death traps when enough shells struck the same location, collapsing earth and stone onto soldiers sheltering below. Das Reich casualties mounted with each passing minute, 10 dead, 20 dead, 30 dead, the count becoming impossible to track as company commanders lost contact with subordinate units. Around 0700 hours, with artillery still falling, American aircraft arrived. The weather had cleared completely, offering perfect flying conditions that allowed Allied air forces to demonstrate their overwhelming superiority. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force appeared first, 12 aircraft carrying 500-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets. They'd been briefed that morning on the Manhay mission: destroy all enemy armor and vehicles in target area. Friendly forces will be marked with colored smoke. Everything south of smoke is enemy. You are cleared hot. The pilots acknowledged orders and climbed into their aircraft, knowing this would be a target-rich environment. Das Reich was about to learn what it meant to fight without air cover. The Thunderbolts worked methodically, circling Manhay at 3,000 feet, while pilots identified targets through the dust and smoke. German flak positions opened fire, 20mm and 37mm guns, putting up curtains of explosive shells, but American pilots had learned to respect flak without fearing it. They dove from altitude, released bombs or fired rockets, then pulled up and away before flak could track them effectively. A Panther attempting to reposition took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb that detonated on the turret roof, the tank's thinnest armor. The explosion blew the turret completely off, killing the crew instantly. Another Panther, immobilized by fuel shortage, was hit by 3 rockets that penetrated the engine deck and set the vehicle ablaze. The crew bailed out and ran for cover, but one of the Thunderbolts strafed them with 50 caliber machine guns, killing 3 of 5. British Typhoons arrived around 0800 hours, adding their devastating firepower to the assault. The Typhoon was arguably the best ground attack aircraft in the European theatre, fast maneuverable, and carrying underwing rockets that could penetrate German armour. Typhoon pilots had developed tactics specifically for tank-killing approach at low altitude to avoid flak, identify target, pull up into firing position, launch rockets in salvo, break away. Each Typhoon carried 8 RP-3 rockets with 60-pound warheads, essentially small artillery shells fired from aircraft. A salvo of 8 rockets created a beaten zone roughly 50 meters across, where anything caught inside would be destroyed. Das Reich's remaining armor became primary targets. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann, the veteran Panther commander, watched 2 of his company's tanks destroyed by Typhoon attacks within 10 minutes. His own Panther was positioned under tree cover that provided some concealment, but Bachmann knew it was only a matter of time before Allied pilots spotted him. He'd survived 3 years of war through combination of skill, aggression, and luck, but luck was running out. The Panther's fuel gauge showed less than quarter tank, maybe 30 kilometers of movement remaining. Ammunition was down to 40 rounds for the main gun. The radio operator had lost contact with battalion headquarters, meaning Bachmann was fighting without orders or coordination. The war had devolved into simple survival: stay alive until nightfall, then try evacuating under cover of darkness. There was no longer any pretense of accomplishing missions or holding objectives. Just survival. The combined artillery and air assault continued for 3 hours, an unprecedented concentration of firepower on an area less than 1 square kilometer. American artillery fired over 4,000 rounds into Manhay during this period. Allied aircraft flew over 250 sorties, dropping tons of bombs and firing hundreds of rockets. The destruction exceeded anything Das Reich veterans had experienced, including the brutal fighting in Normandy or the nightmare retreats across Russia. Buildings ceased to exist. Manhay became a landscape of rubble, craters, and burning wreckage. The smell of high explosives, mixed with smoke from burning vehicles and the sweet, sick odor of torn flesh. Soldiers who survived the bombardment emerged from cellars and foxholes traumatized, shaking, some temporarily deaf from concussion, others babbling incoherently. Even SS training couldn't fully prepare men for such overwhelming violence. Around 0930 hours, American infantry began probing Das Reich's positions. These weren't the hasty frontal assaults of previous days. American commanders had learned. Infantry from the 289th Regiment advanced in small teams, using rubble for cover, calling in artillery on any position that fired at them. Tank destroyers with 90mm guns provided overwatch from hull-down positions, engaging any German armor that revealed itself. It was methodical, professional combined arms warfare that reflected American doctrine executed properly. Das Reich couldn't match this kind of coordinated assault. Their artillery was nearly out of ammunition, their tanks were immobilized or destroyed, their infantry was shattered into isolated pockets, fighting individual battles without coordination or support. The defensive line began collapsing around 1000 hours. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Zimmermann, commanding 2nd Company, attempted rallying his survivors for counterattack. but discovered he commanded perhaps 30 effective soldiers from a company that had numbered over 100 3 days earlier. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Zimmermann organized his 30 men into defensive position in a large crater, hoping to hold until nightfall, allowed withdrawal. American infantry spotted them and called in artillery. High explosive shells bracketed the crater, killing or wounding a dozen Germans in the first minute. Zimmermann took shrapnel in both legs and couldn't stand. His senior sergeant, a veteran who'd survived Kursk, assumed command and ordered surrender. The Americans accepted, treating the captured Germans correctly, providing medical care and water. Zimmermann would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Mississippi, limping on permanently damaged legs but alive. Many of his soldiers weren't as fortunate. By noon on December 28th, Das Reich's defense of Manhay was effectively finished. Small pockets of resistance remained, a Panther hidden in rubble, its crew fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, then setting demolition charges and destroying the tank rather than allowing capture. A squad of Panzer grenadiers holding a cellar until American infantry grenaded them into submission. An officer refusing to surrender, killed by sniper fire while making dramatic last stand. But these were isolated incidents, not coordinated defense. The combination of sustained artillery bombardment and overwhelming air assault had accomplished what 3 days of frontal assaults couldn't, breaking Das Reich's hold on Manhay through sheer material superiority. It was victory through firepower, the American way of war reduced to its essence. We have more shells, more bombs, more aircraft than you can possibly survive. Resistance is futile, surrender or die. The cost was measured in destruction. Manhay no longer existed as a village, just rubble and ruins where a community had stood for centuries. American battlefield assessments estimated that 85 to 90% of structures were completely destroyed. The stone church was rubble, the village square was crater. Civilian property, homes, barns, shops was obliterated. Belgian civilians who returned after the battle found nothing recognizable, their entire lives reduced to debris. Some never returned, moving to cities and starting over rather than rebuilding on ground soaked with blood. The crossroads that had made Manhay strategically valuable remained intact. Roads could be quickly repaired, but the village itself was gone. This raised uncomfortable questions about proportionality and necessity. Was destroying an entire community justified to dislodge an enemy force that would have eventually withdrawn anyway? American commanders said yes, pointing to strategic imperatives and saved American lives. Critics said no, arguing that such destruction represented failure of imagination and excess of firepower. The debate would continue for decades. As afternoon arrived on December 28th, American forces began entering Manhay's ruins. They advanced cautiously, expecting ambushes, but found only destruction, and the occasional German soldier too wounded to evacuate. Engineers began clearing rubble from roads, preparing routes for supply vehicles. Graves registration teams started the grim work of identifying and collecting bodies, American, German, and civilian. Medical personnel established aid stations to treat wounded from both sides. The battle wasn't quite over. Isolated firefights would continue through the night, but the outcome was decided. Das Reich had been defeated, not by superior tactics or braver soldiers, but by an enemy who could afford to expend unlimited ammunition and accept unlimited destruction to achieve objectives. It was a lesson in modern warfare's brutal mathematics. Material superiority eventually defeats tactical excellence, if applied with sufficient ruthlessness. The killing ground at Manhay had claimed hundreds of lives to prove what everyone already knew. December 29th, 1944. 0500 hours. 3rd Armored Division forward positions. Colonel Truman Boudinot stood in the pre-dawn darkness studying Manhay through binoculars, seeing very little through the smoke and dust that still hung over the ruined village. As commander of Combat Command Reserve 3rd Armored Division, Boudinot would lead the final assault that American commanders expected would end German resistance once and for all. He was 41 years old, a West Point graduate who'd commanded armor since before the war, and he understood that what he was about to do was less a battle than a mopping up operation. Yesterday's bombardment had effectively destroyed Das Reich's defensive capabilities. Today's assault would confirm that destruction and allow American forces to claim official victory. It should be straightforward. Boudinot had learned to distrust should-be in warfare. The assault force Boudinot commanded represented overwhelming combat power by any rational standard: 2 full tank battalions, over 60 Sherman tanks, supported by a reinforced infantry regiment, and 2 artillery battalions on call. American intelligence estimated Das Reich had perhaps 20 operational tanks remaining, most immobilized by fuel shortages, and maybe 500 effective infantry scattered across Manhay's ruins. The mathematics favored the Americans so heavily that Boudinot's primary concern was preventing friendly fire incidents rather than enemy resistance. But he'd been fighting Germans for 2 years and respected their ability to make even hopeless situations costly for attackers. So he planned carefully, coordinated thoroughly, and made certain every tank commander understood the operation order before moving out. The plan was simple: 3-pronged assault converging on Manhay from northwest, north, and northeast. Each prong would consist of tank infantry teams advancing inbounds, one element providing overwatch while another moved forward. Artillery would fire on call, responding to any resistance within minutes. Fighter bombers were on standby, ready to strike targets that ground forces identified. Communications were thoroughly rehearsed, every unit knew radio frequencies, recognition signals, and boundaries between formations. It was methodical, professional, and represented American combined arms doctrine, executed competently. If Das Reich had been at full strength with adequate supplies, such an assault would still probably succeed through material superiority. Against their current depleted state, it should be almost bloodless. Should be. At 0530 hours, American artillery began preparation fires, not the overwhelming bombardment of yesterday, but systematic targeting of suspected German positions. Forward observers directed fire onto specific buildings or rubble piles where Germans might be sheltering. The goal wasn't annihilation, but suppression, keeping German defenders pinned while American infantry closed. Shells fell for 20 minutes, then shifted to targets deeper in Manhay, creating a rolling barrage that American forces would follow. At 0550 hours, Boudinot gave the order and his combat command began advancing. 60 Sherman tanks and over 2,000 infantry moved toward Manhay from 3 directions, their approach visible to any German observers, despite pre-dawn darkness. Subtlety was unnecessary when you could simply overwhelm resistance. The Germans remaining in Manhay represented the hardest core of Das Reich's defense, soldiers too stubborn, ideological, or professional to surrender, even when the battle was clearly lost. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Vogel commanded one such group, a composite unit of perhaps 40 men scraped together from shattered companies. Vogel was 24 years old, had been commissioned 6 months earlier after winning battlefield promotion for actions in France, and was now the senior officer in Manhay's eastern sector. He understood his tactical situation perfectly, surrounded, outnumbered, nearly out of ammunition, no possibility of reinforcement or evacuation. Rational calculation suggested immediate surrender. SS training and personal conviction made that impossible. Vogel would fight until killed or captured, his men, most of them equally young and equally indoctrinated, would fight with him. Vogel had positioned his survivors in the ruins of what had been Manhay's schoolhouse, thick stone walls that artillery had damaged but not completely destroyed. His men had spent the night preparing defenses, clearing firing lanes through rubble, positioning their last Panzers rockets to cover approach routes, distributing remaining ammunition equally among riflemen. They had perhaps 50 rounds per man for their Kar-98 rifles, 2 belts for the single MG-42 machine gun that still functioned, and 3 Panzerschreck rockets. It was barely enough for one serious engagement. But Vogel had learned in Russia that a few determined men in good positions could delay much larger forces if they fought intelligently. Delay wouldn't change the battle's outcome, but it might allow other Germans to escape. That was purpose enough. The first American tanks appeared around 06:15 hours. Shermans from the 32nd Armored Regiment advancing cautiously through Manhay's outskirts. Tank commanders kept hatches buttoned, remembering how German anti-tank weapons had ravaged previous attacks, scanning for threats through periscopes. Infantry followed in squad-sized elements, using rubble for cover, moving in short rushes while other squads provided covering fire. It was textbook small unit tactics, the kind of coordination that came from training and experience. The Americans expected resistance but didn't know where or in what strength. They were about to find out. Vogel waited until the lead Sherman was 50 meters away before ordering his Panzerschreck team to fire. The rocket, an 88mm shaped charge warhead, covered the distance in less than a second and hit the Sherman's frontal armor at an angle that allowed penetration. Explosion wasn't as dramatic as earlier tank kills. No ammunition detonation, no instant fireball, but the Sherman stopped moving, smoke pouring from hatches. The crew bailed out, one man on fire, rolling in snow to extinguish flames. The other Shermans immediately reversed, seeking cover, while American infantry hit the ground and tried identifying where the shot came from. Vogel's machine gunner opened fire, raking the American infantry with short bursts. 2 Americans fell, the rest found cover and began returning fire, bullets sparking off stone rubble around the German positions. The engagement lasted 20 minutes and cost both sides casualties they could ill afford. American forces called in artillery that pounded the schoolhouse ruins for 5 minutes, killing or wounding a dozen of Vogel's men. But the remaining Germans continued fighting, their second Panzerschreck team destroying another Sherman before American tank fire collapsed. The wall they were sheltering behind, Vogel, wounded by shrapnel in the shoulder and face, ordered his men to fall back to secondary positions deeper in the ruins. American infantry pursued carefully, clearing rubble pile by rubble pile, tossing grenades into suspicious spaces. It was slow, dangerous work that infantry hated, urban combat where enemies could be anywhere, and death came from unexpected directions. But American numerical superiority was overwhelming. By 0700 hours, Vogel's force was surrounded. He ordered ceasefire and surrender. 23 men walked out with hands raised. The rest were dead or too wounded to move. Similar small battles occurred across Manhay throughout the morning. A panther that had survived yesterday's bombardment emerged from concealment and destroyed 3 Shermans before American tank destroyers bracketed it with 90mm fire. The Panther's commander, attempting to reverse into cover, discovered his fuel tank was empty. The tank stopped mid-movement, and the crew destroyed it with demolition charges rather than allow capture. An SS squad held a cellar for 2 hours against repeated American assaults, finally surrendering only after direct hit from a 105mm howitzer collapsed the cellar entrance and trapped them. But these were isolated incidents, not coordinated defense. Das Reich's organization had disintegrated. Individual leaders fought individual battles with whatever resources remained, buying time for purposes no longer clear, dying because surrender seemed dishonorable or survival impossible. By 0830 hours, American forces controlled Manhay's main crossroads, the junction of Route Nationale 15 and Route Nationale 30 that had made the village strategically valuable. Combat engineers immediately began clearing debris from roads, repairing damaged surfaces, and establishing traffic control. Supply vehicles started moving south, carrying ammunition and fuel to units that would continue pushing toward the German border. The battle for Manhay was effectively over, though firefights continued in the village's eastern sectors, where German holdouts fought on. American commanders declared victory and shifted attention to next objectives. The Bulge offensive was collapsing along its entire front. German forces were retreating and American armies were pursuing. Manhay was yesterday's problem. Today's problems lay ahead. The final German withdrawal from Manhay occurred under cover of darkness on December 29th. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, commanding what remained of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, organized evacuation of survivors through gaps in American lines. Perhaps 200 men escaped, walking wounded, shell-shocked survivors, and a handful of intact units that had maintained cohesion through 5 days of hell. They left behind over 400 dead or captured, dozens of destroyed vehicles, and a reputation for defensive fighting that even enemies grudgingly respected. Weidinger himself escaped, would fight through the rest of the war, and survived to write memoirs that portrayed Manhay as heroic last stand against overwhelming odds. The reality was more complex and less glorious, but veterans rarely remember defeats accurately. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann also escaped, driving his Panther until fuel exhaustion forced abandonment 6 kilometers east of Manhay. He and his crew destroyed the tank, their home for 6 months, and walked toward German lines through freezing darkness. Bachmann would survive the war, return to civilian life in Germany, and spend decades trying to reconcile his experiences with post-war reality. He'd commanded one of the most feared tanks in the German arsenal, had killed dozens of enemy vehicles, had survived battles that killed most of his comrades. But survival brought its own burdens. Memories of burning Shermans with American crews dying inside haunted him. The knowledge that he'd fought for a regime responsible for unprecedented evil complicated his sense of professional accomplishment. Like many veterans, Bachmann discovered that surviving war was only the beginning of a longer struggle to live with what war revealed about human nature and personal choices. By noon on December 29th, American flags flew over Manhay's ruins, photographed by Stars and Stripes correspondents for newspapers back home. The images showed victorious American soldiers posing beside destroyed German tanks, smiling for cameras as if they'd won great victory. What the photographs didn't show was the destroyed village. The hundreds of dead from both sides, the wounded screaming in aid stations, the exhausted survivors who'd aged years in 5 days. War correspondents wrote stories praising American resilience and tactical brilliance, conveniently omitting the failed frontal assaults and high casualties of the first 3 days. American citizens reading these accounts learned that Manhay was recaptured after fierce fighting, that German forces were retreating, that victory in Europe was assured. They didn't learn the cost or complexity or moral ambiguity of that victory. Perhaps they didn't need to know. Perhaps soldiers preferred they didn't know. The Battle for Manhay officially ended at 1400 hours on December 29th, when the 3rd Armored Division reported the village secured and all organized resistance eliminated. The entire operation, from German assault on December 24th through American recapture on December 29th, had lasted 114 hours. In that time, hundreds of men had died fighting over a Crossroads village that by war's end no longer existed. Roads could be repaired, armies could advance, but Manhay itself was gone, and the people who'd lived there for generations were displaced. The tactical victory was real. German offensive capabilities in that sector were destroyed, and American forces could continue advancing, but the human cost and physical destruction raised questions about whether different approaches might have achieved similar results with less devastation. American commanders didn't ask those questions. They moved on to next objectives, leaving historians and philosophers to debate what Manhay meant. December 30th, 1944. 0800 hours. Manhay ruins. Lieutenant Robert Simmons commanded a graves registration platoon, which meant he supervised the collection and identification of dead American soldiers. At 26, he was older than most junior officers, had worked as a funeral director in Philadelphia before the war, and possessed the temperament necessary for work that broke other men psychologically. This morning, as he walked through Manhay's ruins with clipboard and body bags, Simmons tried maintaining professional detachment that 3 years of war had taught him. Bodies were just bodies, organic matter that had once housed human consciousness, but now required processing according to army regulations. If you thought of them as people with families and futures, you couldn't do the job. So Simmons didn't think, he just worked. The American dead lay everywhere, some in positions suggesting they died instantly, others in postures indicating slower, more agonizing deaths. Frozen corpses were easier to handle than fresh casualties. They didn't bleed or smell as badly, could be stacked like cordwood without falling apart. Simmons' team moved methodically through assigned sectors, checking each body for identification tags, recording names and serial numbers, loading remains into trucks for transport to temporary cemeteries. It was grim, exhausting work, performed in sub-zero temperatures by men who received little recognition and less appreciation. But someone had to do it. Families back home wanted their sons returned for burial. The army needed accurate casualty counts for planning and records, so graves registration teams collected the dead and tried preserving some dignity in a process that reduced human beings to logistics problems. The preliminary casualty figures emerging from Manhay shocked even experienced staff officers. American losses from December 24th through December 29th totaled approximately 350 killed in action, another 400 wounded, seriously enough to require evacuation, and over 150 missing or captured. Combined, the 3rd Armored Division and supporting units had lost nearly 900 men, roughly equivalent to an entire infantry battalion, in 5 days of fighting. Tank losses were equally staggering, 68 Sherman tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, meaning the division had lost nearly 40% of its armored strength. Supporting vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, tank destroyers added another 100 vehicles to the loss list. It was the kind of attrition rate that would break some divisions, and the 3rd Armored had absorbed it while maintaining offensive operations. But such losses couldn't be sustained indefinitely. German casualties were harder to calculate precisely, but American intelligence pieced together estimates from prisoner interrogations and battlefield surveys. Das Reich had committed roughly 1,200 men to the Manhay operation. Perhaps 250 to 300 were confirmed dead, found in rubble or defensive positions where they'd fought to the end. Another 200 to 250 were captured, most wounded, but some uninjured, and simply unable or unwilling to continue fighting. The remainder, perhaps 500 to 600 men, had escaped during the nighttime withdrawal, though many were walking wounded, who would require extended hospitalization. Das Reich's armor losses were complete. 32 tanks destroyed or abandoned, including the feared Panthers that had dominated early engagements. Supporting vehicles and equipment were similarly devastated. As a combat-effective formation, the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment essentially ceased to exist at Manhay. It would require months of rest and refitting before returning to combat strength. The casualty ratios, roughly 1.2 American casualties to 1 German casualty, suggested that Das Reich had inflicted serious damage despite being outnumbered and outgunned. In tactical terms, the Germans had performed remarkably well, holding Manhay for 5 days against overwhelming force and exacting heavy price for every meter of ground. But in strategic terms, such ratios were unsustainable for Germany. The Americans could replace losses within weeks. New tanks shipped from factories, new soldiers from training camps, new equipment from an industrial base producing material faster than armies could consume it. Germany had no such capacity. Every tank destroyed was nearly irreplaceable. Every veteran killed represented training and experience that couldn't be duplicated. The mathematics of attrition, warfare, favored whoever could afford losses, and by December 1944, Germany could afford nothing. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armored Division, received casualty reports without visible emotion. Rose was famously demanding, rarely satisfied, and constitutionally incapable of praising subordinates, even when they performed well. His division had recaptured Manhay, as ordered, had destroyed an elite SS regiment in the process, and had demonstrated the kind of aggressive offensive spirit Rose valued above everything except results. But the casualty figures bothered even Rose. 900 men in 5 days was acceptable in major offensives, where strategic objectives justified losses. For a Crossroads village of no intrinsic importance, such casualties raised questions about tactical competence and operational necessity. Rose didn't second-guess decisions publicly. That would undermine confidence. But privately he wondered if different approaches might have achieved similar results, more economically. He would never know, and the war demanded attention to future operations rather than past mistakes. The destruction of Manhay itself represented another kind of cost, one that military accounting didn't measure, but humanitarian observers couldn't ignore. Before the battle, Manhay had been a functioning community of roughly 300 civilians living in 50-odd homes and associated buildings. After the battle, perhaps 15 to 20 buildings retained walls sufficient to provide shelter, and none were habitable without major repairs. The village, church, spiritual center of the community for centuries was rubble. The school was destroyed. The few shops that had served local needs were gone. Belgian civilians returning to assess damage found nothing salvageable. Families that had lived in Manhay for generations suddenly had no homes, no possessions, no livelihoods. Some received compensation from Belgian or American authorities years later, but money couldn't replace lives lived in familiar surroundings or communities destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. The Belgian government conducted investigations after the war, attempting to document civilian casualties and determine responsibility for Manhay's destruction. Official records listed 18 civilian deaths directly attributable to the battle, mostly elderly residents who'd refused to evacuate, plus a few who'd been caught in crossfire while trying to escape. Unofficial estimates suggested the true number was higher, perhaps 25 to 30, but chaos of combat made accurate counts impossible. Bodies buried in rubble weren't discovered for weeks or months. Some civilians simply disappeared, their fates unknown. Whether they'd fled to relatives elsewhere, died unremarked in the fighting, or were killed and never properly identified, remained unclear. War created uncertainties that peacetime bureaucracies couldn't resolve, leaving families without closure and historians without complete records. The recriminations began almost immediately. American corps and division commanders blamed each other for the initial disaster that allowed Das Reich to capture Manhay. Major General Robert Hasbrouck of the 7th Armored Division argued his exhausted units should never have been positioned at Manhay without rest and refitting. Major General Maurice Rose of the 3rd Armored Division argued that proper coordination between divisions would have prevented the breakthrough. Corps Commander Major General J. Lawton Collins argued that both division commanders had failed to properly coordinate defenses and counterattacks. Each had valid points. Each also had reason to deflect blame from their own decisions. The truth, as usually happens in military disasters, was that multiple failures at multiple levels created conditions for catastrophe. Identifying single causes satisfied institutional needs for accountability, but rarely reflected combat's messy reality. Remarkably, no American officers were relieved of command or formally disciplined for Manhay, when several generals lost their commands for failing to stem German advances. The difference reflected both institutional politics and strategic timing. By late December, the Bulge offensive was clearly failing. German forces were retreating, and Allied victory seemed assured. American commanders wanted to project confidence and competence rather than acknowledge mistakes. Relieving generals for Manhay would have attracted attention to a battle the army preferred minimizing in public accounts. So official reports praised aggressive counterattacks and successful recapture, while quietly omitting failed assaults and excessive casualties. Institutional memory was sanitized for public consumption, preserving reputations at the cost of accurate historical records. The tactical lessons identified in after-action reports revealed how much American forces still needed to learn about combined arms warfare. First, night combat required specialized training that most American units lacked. German forces had demonstrated superior night fighting capabilities that allowed outnumbered troops to achieve surprise and inflict disproportionate casualties. Second, ad hoc task force organizations, mixing units from different divisions without proper coordination, created confusion that undermined combat effectiveness. Third, hasty frontal assaults against prepared positions were costly regardless of numerical superiority. Fourth, proper combined arms coordination, infantry, armor, artillery, and air working together, could overcome defensive positions that individual arms couldn't break. These weren't revolutionary insights. They were basic military principles that American forces were still learning to apply consistently in December 1944. The American military's institutional response to Manhay reflected broader patterns in how the U.S. Army approached combat in World War II. Rather than developing sophisticated tactics or emphasizing unit excellence, American doctrine accepted that tactical competence would develop gradually through combat experience. In the meantime, material superiority, more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft than enemies could match, would compensate for tactical shortcomings. This approach was enormously costly in lives and material, but ultimately effective given America's industrial capacity and manpower resources. Manhay exemplified this strategic choice. American forces eventually won through overwhelming firepower rather than tactical brilliance, accepting casualties that would have been unsustainable for smaller nations. Whether this represented wise strategy or wasteful execution remained debatable, though results were undeniable. Comparative analysis with other Bulge battles revealed that Manhay's casualty ratios were actually typical for American offensive operations. Throughout the European theater, American forces generally suffered roughly equal or slightly higher casualties than Germans when attacking prepared positions. The ratio improved as the war progressed and American units gained experience, but it never reached the 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratios that military theorists suggested attackers should accept as normal. This reflected both German defensive skill and American tactical limitations. German soldiers, especially SS troops and elite Wehrmacht units, were often better trained and more experienced than American counterparts. They occupied well-prepared positions, used terrain effectively, and fought with determination born of desperation. American advantages lay in material superiority and air power rather than individual tactical excellence. Manhay demonstrated this pattern clearly. By January 1, 1945, exactly 1 week after Das Reich's initial assault, Manhay had been relegated to footnote status in official accounts of the Bulge offensive. The battle never achieved the fame of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne's surrounded stand captured public imagination. It lacked the dramatic breakthrough of Patton's relief column driving north. It wasn't featured in newsreels or mentioned in presidential addresses. Manhay was just another small battle in a war full of small battles, remarkable only to those who fought there and those who died there. Survivors would remember it vividly. The night of December 24th, when German tanks rolled through darkness, the failed counterattacks, the endless artillery bombardments. But institutional memory was already moving on, focusing on the pursuit into Germany and ultimate victory that everyone could see approaching. Manhay's dead would be buried, its ruins would be rebuilt or abandoned, and its tactical lessons would be filed in reports that few would read. That was war's reality. Individual battles mattered intensely to participants, but disappeared into larger narratives of nations and armies. The reckoning at Manhay revealed war's essential nature. Enormous cost for limited gains, suffering distributed unequally among combatants and civilians, victory determined more by material resources than tactical skill or moral superiority. The Americans won because they could afford to lose tanks and men faster than they could be replaced, then replace them and attack again. The Germans lost because they couldn't afford losses they inflicted on enemies, couldn't replace equipment faster than it was destroyed, couldn't sustain operations against foes with unlimited resources. This was modern industrial warfare reduced to accounting tonnage of shells fired, numbers of tanks destroyed, casualty ratios, logistical calculations. Individual courage mattered less than national economies. Tactical brilliance mattered less than factory production. The Battle of Manhay proved what everyone already knew in wars between industrial powers: the side with more factories eventually wins. Everything else is details. January 15th, 1945. 3rd U.S. Army Field Hospital, Luxembourg. Private First Class Robert Chen lay in a hospital bed trying to remember what had happened. The last clear memory was his foxhole south of Manhay, hearing movement in darkness, calling out the challenge. Everything after that was fragments: white-clad figures emerging from trees, muzzle flashes, burning pain across his chest and shoulder, lying in snow, unable to move, while boots crunched past his position. He'd been found 36 hours later by American soldiers, retaking the area, barely alive, suffering from hypothermia and blood loss that should have killed him. Army surgeons had removed 3 bullets from his torso, repaired damaged muscles and organs, and pronounced him remarkably lucky. Chen didn't feel lucky. He felt broken in ways that extended beyond physical injuries. The war was over for him. He'd be evacuated to England, then eventually shipped home to San Francisco. But something essential had been torn away on that frozen hillside, and Chen suspected he'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he'd lost. Across Germany, in a prisoner of war camp near Nuremberg, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Kane adjusted to captivity with the disciplined stoicism that had made him successful officer. Kane had been captured when Das Reich overran his command post on December 25th, wounded in both legs by grenade shrapnel. German medical personnel had treated his wounds adequately. SS troops generally respected Geneva Conventions regarding prisoner treatment, at least for Western Allied captives, and he'd been transported through German rear areas to this camp. Here, several hundred American and British officers waited out the war's end in reasonable conditions. They had adequate food, shelter, and medical care. They received Red Cross packages. They could write letters home, though correspondence was censored and delayed. What they lacked was freedom and knowledge of how the war was progressing. Kane spent his days reading, exercising within the compound's limits, and trying not to think about the soldiers he'd left behind at Manhay. Command had been his life. Losing it felt like losing purpose. In a military hospital in Trier, American Sergeant Richard Morrison was learning to walk again. The German surgeon who'd splinted his shattered leg in Manhay's church basement had done excellent work under terrible conditions, probably saving the leg from amputation. But extensive damage required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. Morrison was 24 years old and faced the real possibility that he'd never walk normally again. The doctors were optimistic. Young men healed quickly. Morrison's determination impressed physical therapists, but recovery would take years. He'd received Purple Heart and would eventually receive medical discharge with partial disability pension. His tank commander career was finished. The leg would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life, reminding him of Christmas 1944, when his Sherman had been destroyed and his life had changed forever in ways he was only beginning to understand. SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Krause, the Das Reich regimental surgeon, was dead. Killed by American artillery on December 28th, while treating wounded in Manhay's church, his body had been buried in a mass grave with other German dead. His family in Munich wouldn't learn of his death until months later, when a letter from his commanding officer finally reached them through chaos of Germany's collapse. Krause's widow, Anna, was left with 2 young children, no income, and limited prospects in a nation heading toward defeat. She would remarry after the war. to a lawyer who'd lost his wife to Allied bombing. The children would grow up calling their stepfather father, and barely remembering the medical officer who'd died trying to save wounded soldiers of both sides. Krause's personal effects, a few letters, photographs, his wedding ring, would eventually be returned to his family, though the context of his death would remain unclear for decades. He was just one of millions who died in the war, remarkable only to those who knew him. SS Obersturmbannführer Ernst Bachmann survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp before repatriation to Germany. He returned to his hometown in the Rhineland, found work as a mechanic, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 3 children while trying to forget what he'd seen and done in 6 years of war. But Manhay haunted him. Bachmann would wake at night, remembering Sherman tanks exploding, knowing that men had died inside them because of his skill and ruthlessness. He'd been extraordinarily good at his job. 5 kill rings on his Panthers gun barrel testified to that, but being good at killing troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. In the 1960s, Bachmann began corresponding with American veterans, including some whose units he'd fought at Manhay. These exchanges were cautious at first, both sides uncertain what to say to former enemies. But gradually, something like understanding developed. They'd all been young men following orders, fighting for causes they barely understood, surviving through luck as much as skill. None wanted to repeat the experience. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, the regimental commander who'd led Das Reich's assault on Manhay, survived the war and spent years in Allied custody while authorities investigated his role in various SS operations. He was eventually released without prosecution, having convinced investigators that he'd commanded combat troops rather than participating in war crimes that other SS units had committed. Weidinger returned to civilian life, worked in business, and in his 50s began writing military histories of Das Reich's campaigns. His books presented Manhay as heroic defensive battle against overwhelming odds, emphasizing German tactical skill while minimizing atrocities the division had committed in Russia and elsewhere. These accounts were popular among German veterans seeking validation and controversial among historians who recognized their selective memory and moral evasions. Weidinger died in 1990, still defending his wartime service and arguing that Das Reich soldiers were professional troops unfairly associated with SS crimes they didn't commit. History judged him less charitably. The Belgian village of Manhay was rebuilt slowly over several years following the war. The Belgian government provided some reconstruction assistance, but resources were limited in a nation recovering from 5 years of occupation and combat damage. Some families returned and rebuilt on their original property. Others sold their land and moved to cities where economic opportunities were better. The village that eventually emerged was different from what had existed before, more spread out with modern construction replacing centuries-old stone buildings, less cohesive as a community, because original residents had been dispersed, and newcomers arrived without historical connections to the place. The church was rebuilt by 1950, a modern structure that looked nothing like the stone building that had stood for 4 centuries. Older residents complained that it lacked character, but younger people appreciated that it had heating and electricity. Progress meant forgetting, and perhaps forgetting was necessary to move forward. In 1952, local veterans from both sides began organizing commemorations at Manhay. These gatherings were awkward. Initially, former enemies meeting at the site where they tried killing each other 8 years earlier. American veterans arrived in tourist clothes, often bringing families, treating trips as vacations with historical interest. German veterans came more quietly, conscious that SS service remained controversial and that admitting you'd fought for Hitler's regime could trigger hostile reactions. But at Manhay itself, on the ground where the battle had occurred, something remarkable happened. Veterans from both sides recognized shared experience that transcended nationality and ideology. They'd all been young men sent to fight in winter conditions, all suffered fear and cold and loss of friends, all emerged traumatized by violence they'd witnessed and participated in. Political leaders had created the war. Young men had fought it. Those who survived shared bond that former enemies could understand in ways that civilians never would. By the 1970s and 80s, Manhay commemorations had become annual events drawing dozens of veterans from America, Britain, and Germany. They walked the battlefield, now mostly farmland and forest again, trying to locate where specific events had occurred. Positions that had seemed critical during battle looked unremarkable in peacetime, just ordinary hillsides and road intersections. The veterans were old men now, in their 60s and 70s, bodies marked by age and old wounds. They told stories, sometimes contradictory, about battles each side remembered differently. American veterans recalled desperate defense and hard-won victory. German veterans remembered skillful assault and tactical excellence, despite ultimate defeat. The truth lay somewhere between competing narratives, but truth mattered less than the act of remembering together. These gatherings provided closure that official histories never could, allowing men to acknowledge what they'd experienced and find meaning in survival. A small museum was established in Manhay in 1994 for the battle's 50th anniversary. Local historians collected artifacts, weapons, equipment, photographs, personal items from soldiers who'd fought there, and created exhibits explaining what had happened and why it mattered. The museum was modest by institutional standards, occupying a renovated barn, staffed by volunteers, surviving on minimal budget. But it served important function, preserving memory of events that were being forgotten, as veterans died and younger generations focused on present rather than past. School groups visited, learning about war through local history. Tourists driving through stopped occasionally, spending 30 minutes reading displays before continuing their journeys. The museum represented modest but genuine effort to ensure that Manhay's battle wasn't completely forgotten, that those who died there were remembered, that future generations understood the cost of conflicts their predecessors had fought. Historical recognition of Manhay remained limited compared to more famous Bulge battles. Bastogne dominated public memory, books, films, documentaries celebrated the 101st Airborne stand and Patton's relief column. St. Vith received attention for its prolonged defense. But Manhay appeared in historical accounts mainly as footnote, a minor action during larger offensive. Few books focused exclusively on the battle. No major films depicted it. Most Americans, even those interested in World War II history, had never heard of Manhay. This obscurity bothered some veterans who felt their sacrifices deserved recognition. Others were relieved to avoid publicity, preferring to remember fallen comrades privately rather than participating in public commemorations that often felt performative. Historical importance wasn't distributed fairly. Some battles achieved fame through circumstances having little to do with their actual significance, while equally costly actions were forgotten because they didn't fit compelling narratives that popular histories required. The Battle of Manhay left lasting impacts on military doctrine that extended far beyond its tactical details. American armor and infantry schools studied the battle as case study in night combat, combined arms coordination, and the challenges of hasty defensive operations. The password, compromise that had allowed Das Reich troops to infiltrate American lines, led to more frequent password changes and better security procedures. The effectiveness of German night assaults prompted expanded night fighting training in American units. The difficulty of coordinating operations between divisions led to improved liaison procedures and clearer command relationships. These were practical lessons implemented gradually that probably saved lives in subsequent operations. Whether they justified Manhay's casualties was an unanswerable question. Institutional learning always came at someone's expense. By December 2024, 80 years after the battle, only a handful of Manhay veterans remained alive. Most were in their late 90s or past 100, physically frail, memories fading. They'd outlived wives and siblings, often friends and sometimes children. They represented living links to events increasingly remote to younger generations for whom World War II was ancient history, as distant as the First World War had been to soldiers in 1944. These last survivors attended commemorations when health permitted, offering brief remarks about experiences they'd spent decades processing. They emphasized not glory or heroism but war's waste and stupidity, how young men died for reasons that seemed less clear with passing time, how victory and defeat both involved suffering that peacetime generations couldn't comprehend. Their message was simple: remember what happened, understand its cost, work to prevent repetition. Whether anyone was listening remained unclear. Manhay today is a quiet rural community of roughly 4,000 residents, a mixture of old families with local roots and newcomers attracted by affordable housing and rural character. The crossroads that made it strategically valuable in 1944 still exists. Route National 15 and Route National 30 intersect in the village center, but now carries civilian traffic rather than military convoys. A small memorial stands near the intersection, listing names of soldiers from both sides who died in the battle. Fresh flowers appear there regularly, placed by unknown hands, suggesting someone still remembers. The village hosts occasional commemorative events, though attendance has declined as veterans died and public interest waned. Life continues in Manhay, mostly disconnected from its violent past, though echoes remain for those who listen. Every December, when snow falls and temperatures drop, older residents remember stories their parents told about the Christmas when war came to their village and nothing was ever quite the same afterward. The question of what Manhay meant, whether those deaths achieved anything worth their cost, remained unanswerable. From narrow military perspective, the battle successfully defended a crossroads, delayed German offensive operations, and demonstrated American ability to overcome tactical defeats through material superiority. From broader perspective, Manhay was one small battle in a war that would have been won regardless of its outcome, making those specific deaths essentially meaningless except to families and friends left behind. Perhaps the only honest answer was that Manhay meant whatever participants and survivors needed it to mean: sacrifice for freedom, waste of young lives, validation of courage, demonstration of war's futility. Each interpretation was true and incomplete. The battle happened, hundreds died, survivors carried memories the rest of their lives, and history moved forward indifferent to individual suffering that large events created. That was war's ultimate lesson, learned again at Manhay, as it had been learned at thousands of other battles across centuries. Individual lives matter intensely to individuals but barely register in history's larger patterns. The echoes of Manhay would fade as the last veterans died, and memory became history, and eventually history would become just another story that nobody remembered completely or understood fully.